Chapter 454. The competition among 4 forces had entered the semifinals. Only 4 participants were left. Everyone was paying attention to the news surrounding both the fights at first. However, their attention had mainly started to get focused on Yi Shiwen's fight. They wanted to know if that would be an interesting fight or not. And this was because Emperor Chen's opponent was too weak. The debate on whether Yi Shiwen was more powerful or the Xian Yuan twin stars were stronger had continued ever since they had been paired opposite each other. Yi Shiwen had displayed tyrannical strength. However, twin stars brothers were 2 individuals, and each of them was powerful enough to be ranked as a heaven's pride expert. Their combined strength could scare a person to death. The people would finally get the answer today. But the supporters of each side hadn't yielded to the other side until now. However, it wasn't the time to decide this verbally anymore. Words had no importance now. Only an all-out battle could decide who was stronger. Several disciples had arrived early in the observation microcosm to watch the fight, and the 4 supreme leaders of the 4 forces had also arrived on time above the tall platform. Each of these 4 forces had lost a great amount of experts in the competition so far. Especially, the True Martial University had lost a Peak Heavens Pride expert named Qin Wang, and the Fire Cloud Cave had lost its only Heavens Pride expert. However, they must attend the competition no matter how depressed they were. Moreover, their hearts were quite stable. The casualties of these young experts hadn't exceeded their expectations. They would take part in the competition every time in order to win the championship. However, they also came prepared for serious losses. Yi Shiwen had arrived early in the arena today. He was the first one to enter the microcosm. He was calmly waiting for the Twin Stars brothers to arrive. The Twin Stars brothers were surprised to see Yi Shiwen when they arrived. They became somewhat baffled at this. They had collected more and more information on Yi Shiwen as he became more and more famous recently. Some of the information was also about his habits. Yi Shiwen was habitual of arriving late at any place. However, he had unexpectedly arrived early this time. Yi Shiwen, you have come so early today. Are you in a hurry to die? The Twin Stars brothers said as they looked at Yi Shiwen. Then, they suddenly burst into laughter. Yes, I'm in a hurry. But I'm in a hurry to kill you. Yi Shiwen refused to yield and replied, Someone like you will kill us. The Twin Stars brothers sneered and said in unison, Well, you never know until you give it a try. Yi Shiwen replied solemnly. It seemed as if whatever they had said had been completely irrelevant to his ears. The complexions of the Twin Stars brothers had turned callous. They were observing Yi Shiwen. Then, they suddenly surrounded him from both sides. The 2 brothers looked exactly the same. The only difference was that one had red-colored beard, and the other one had blue-colored long hair. Both of them were handsome, appearance-wise. They were tall and slim. A strange light was flashing in their eyes. The powerful energy surged up in their entire bodies. A part of their imposing auras soared up into the sky. Both of them were dreadful experts. Yi Shiwen merely let out a faint smile. His golden divinities began to boil under his feet. A burst of golden waves swept out like mighty waves, and he started to surf on them. You say, who do you think will win this fight? The fight had not begun yet. However, a group of disciples had already begun to make speculations. I guess Yi Shiwen will win. After all, he's so formidable. He had defeated Qi Tian effortlessly. These Xian Yuan's twin stars aren't even worth mentioning. I don't agree with you. After all, Qi Tian was ranked below the Xian Yuan twin stars. And most importantly, they are 2 individuals. Moreover, one of them possesses the fire spirit, and the other one possesses the water spirit. Such types of physiques don't even appear once in thousands of years. These are also a kind of special physique. They were born with the principle of water attribute and the principle of fire attribute. These are extraordinary principles. These 2 principles generally repel each other. However, these principles have become compatible with each other since they are twins. A mixture of water and fire would have boundless might. However, no one has been able to compel them to collaborate so far. I hope Yishiwen can do that. Attack! The elder brother, Huichi, attacked this time. He didn't use any weapon. He merely shot his fist forward. His fists absorbed the clouds in the sky and transformed into a pair of two incomparably massive fists. They then pounded towards Yishiwen. This pair of fists was glowing with flames and looked exceptionally terrifying. Yishiwen shot his palm upward, and it transformed into a giant golden dragon. It faced upward and roared. Then it soared upward and collided with that pair of fists. It seemed as if the area around that pair of fists had transformed into a world of flames, and the fire principles were twining around the flames. This looked incomparably powerful and profound, as if the ancient god of fire himself was seated within the flames. He was born with the spirit of fire. He had been innately close to the principle of fire attribute. He could feel the principle of fire since childhood. An average person couldn't come close to him in this aspect. The giant golden dragon burst into that world of fire and collided with that god of fire. Bang! The complementary waves of this collision swept out wantonly. The void got shattered under its effect. It ripped open a crack in the space, and it seemed like a dense spider web had been formed in the sky. Many mountains in the surroundings had been flattened since they couldn't withstand such a terrifying impact. Everyone went in uproar. They hadn't anticipated that the fight would become so terrifying in the beginning itself. Many people saw that this collision had happened between the golden dragon and the god of fire. They clearly saw Huichi's fist intention and Yishiwen's palm intention, grappling with each other with all their might. Both of them had comprehended the fist technique and the palm technique to a considerable extent. In fact, they had already comprehended the creative concept. And the most terrifying thing was that their comprehension of the creative concept was at the peak. This meant that both of them possessed complete understanding of their respective moves. In other words, they could display the moves in their original states. Most sage experts couldn't pull that off. This also meant that both of them were determined to kill each other. They didn't wish to let the opposite party survive. Their attacks were peerless killer moves. The fire god stood up from the ground. His eyes emitted dazzling rays of light. He displayed a set of fist techniques. He stimulated the fire attribute principles of the entire world, and they began to boil. He was the god in the midst of this fire world. He was the ruler of this place. Nobody could disobey the principles laid down by him. His fist pounded on the golden dragon. It seemed as if he would seize the dragon with his bare hands. Roar! The golden dragon faced upwards and let out a loud roar. Divine dragon flings its tail. Its long tail swept across. Its speed was extremely quick, similar to that of lighting. It swept out within a split second. The fire god didn't get the time to respond and got hit. The golden dragon had opened a crack in the perfect body of this fire god. The fire god had been whipped away, and he went flying as a result. He had stood firmly on his feet a moment ago. He roared. It was evident that he wasn't willing to give up. The golden dragon, once again, rushed towards him. It didn't give him any opportunity to breathe. The golden dragon brandished its claws and displayed the coiling dragon palm. This coiling dragon palm came out in the form of a dragon. This palm attack suddenly inspired the very essence of heaven and earth and advanced towards the fire god. Bang! The fire god hadn't anticipated that the golden dragon would pursue him closely and would arrive close to him so fast. He got caught off guard, and that pair of dragon's claws pierced into his chest. Roar! The golden dragon roared and ripped apart that fire god in the sky. Endless rays of light fluttered about in the sky, and the fire principles wailed. The fire god roared after getting torn into two halves. Then he died a tragic death on the spot. Puff! Huichi suddenly spouted a mouthful of blood and retreated several steps. The fire god had been an incarnation of his fist intention. Therefore, he suffered a huge psychological rebound when the fire god got torn into two halves after his spirit was annihilated. Everyone stared in utter shock. They were watching this exceptionally quick fight between the fire god and the golden dragon. However, it took only a moment for the outcome of this fight to appear before all. It seemed as if this fight between a dragon and a god had reminded them of the fights between the dragon race and the gods of the mythological era, as mentioned in the legends. These fights had continued since the prehistoric era and had lasted till the mythological age. It was a grandiose and disastrous fight. It seemed as if it were a reenactment, a fight from that era. This battle had only lasted for a moment, but Huichi had been wounded within such a short time. This had made the spectators extremely excited. Someone had sustained injury in the beginning of the fight. It clearly meant that both sides were resorting to extreme methods against each other. They had a lot of expectations from this fight. They were excited because they were hoping to see a splendid battle. And the way it had started was enough to hint that this might turn out to be a battle that would shake the heavens. "Yi Shiwen, you'll die soon!" Yi Shiwen suddenly heard a loud shout from his back. A blue-colored, gigantic foot suddenly stepped down. It seemed as if it would crush him into meat paste. This gigantic foot was as clear as water. It was dazzling with a scary blue color. It seemed like a foot of some god. It seemed as if it would destroy the world and would extinguish it forever. Of course, it was Hualan's attack. He hadn't anticipated that Yi Shiwen would turn out to be so terrifying at first. These brothers would always fight together against their opponents. However, they hadn't done so this time, quite simply because they were fed up of other people saying that they could only fight as a team. In fact, many of their Xianyuan Palace Hall's disciples had become skeptical about them. Could the Twin Stars brothers prevail over a powerful Heaven's pride expert if they fought one-on-one and not 2-to-1? These two individuals had gone through a lot of troubles when they had faced Han Bingwang. This had portrayed the Twin Stars brothers like a pair of paper tigers, and this rumor had spread everywhere. For a moment, it had seemed as if they didn't possess any skill apart from the advantage of having numerical superiority. This had made them extremely angry. They had discussed this with each other. They must fight with Yi Shiwen one-on-one. It would be better if they could kill him alone and not as a team. In that case, they would be able to wash the shameful stigma attached to them. However, they hadn't anticipated that Yi Shiwen would be so fierce. They had thought that they could block his attacks, just like they had done with other opponents. However, they hadn't anticipated that Huichi's fist intention would be shattered by Yi Shiwen's palm intention in this fight. To be continued. Chapter 455. The outcome of the fight between Yi Shiwen and Huichi had been revealed within a short period of time. Nobody had imagined that it would be a checkmate situation at such an early stage. Huichi had been injured even quicker than Qi Tian. Hualan gritted his teeth in hatred. Didn't this outcome prove the embarrassing fact that the Twin Stars brothers were worse than Qi Tian? It was rumored that they might not have been able to enter the semifinals if they didn't have the numerical advantage of being twins. This rumor had already been in circulation everywhere, and they would be embarrassed in front of everyone if they were to be defeated by Yi Shiwen. In fact, it didn't matter even if they didn't get killed because they would be ashamed to death in the end. However, Hualan couldn't bear anymore and pounded his foot towards Yi Shiwen as soon as he saw that Huichi had been momentarily forced back by Yi Shiwen. His foot technique was extremely dreadful. In fact, it was powerful enough to trample the entire world. Yi Shiwen finally moved into action. He was very powerful, but not enough to ignore the might of their attacks. He withdrew to evade Hualan's offensive. He then turned around and shot his fist upward towards the sole of the foot. It was just pure fist intention. It had no other additional force attached to it. An extremely tyrannical power swept out. The void got shattered by the fist's attack. The void disintegrated, and a huge crack opened as the fist attack went towards the incoming big foot. Rumble! That big foot was ripped apart in the sky by Yi Shiwen's fist attack. Hualan suddenly screamed. His leg had nearly been broken by Yi Shiwen's fist attack. Blood was dripping from his leg, and he was left to scream to no end. However, he had fortunately withdrawn in time. Otherwise, his entire body would have been torn apart by Yi Shiwen. He looked at Yi Shiwen in disbelief. He couldn't believe that Yi Shiwen's body was so intrepid. He had fought with people who possessed strong bodies in the past. Even his own body had the water spirit. Therefore, his own body was extremely tyrannical. He had often used his body to bully and humiliate other people in his previous fights. The spirit of fire and the spirit of water didn't have the traits of an intrepid body. However, they were still far more tyrannical than an ordinary physique type. In fact, it was no less than a case of courting death for an average person to challenge them. However, they had never fought against any well-known special physique. They hadn't given any attention to Qi Tian. After all, he had been effortlessly defeated by Yi Shiwen. So, he was nothing more than a weak loser in their eyes. And they had thought that any such loser couldn't be compared with them. However, they had realized how strong Yi Shiwen was after they had started this fight. He was like a golden god of war and possessed dreadful fighting strength. Everyone was stunned. Yi Shiwen had surprisingly wounded both the Twin Stars brothers within a short time. Such fighting strength was enough to scare anyone to death. Many people had been quite optimistic about Yi Shiwen before the start of this contest. After all, Yi Shiwen's accomplishments looked more splendid compared to those of the Twin Stars brothers. He had effortlessly defeated Qi Tian, a fighter who had been placed third in the rankings. Most people had guessed that the Xian Yuan Twin Stars brothers couldn't be Yi Shiwen's opponents. However, they hadn't thought that it would happen so quickly. How's this possible? How can they be wounded so quickly? They really differ by far from Qi Tian. It seems they had earned such a big reputation by fluke. A disciple spoke up in utter disbelief. He couldn't believe that Yi Shiwen had used only one move to wound the Twin Stars brothers, since these two used to be favorites to win this competition. The complexions of several disciples of the Fire Cloud Cave had turned ugly as they saw the disciple of the Muddy Sky Island who had said this. He had spoken that about the Twin Stars brothers. However, these words were also demeaning towards the deceased Qi Tian. However, a lot of people acknowledged his words as well. They couldn't understand why the Twin Stars brothers, who were definitely more tyrannical than Qi Tian as a team, looked so weak in front of Yi Shiwen. Even their performance was much worse than that of Qi Tian's. This had simply subverted their observations regarding these three individuals. Yeah, how there can be such a big disparity between them. This is unbelievable. Someone complied in disbelief. What's strange in that? Qi Fifan was also watching this fight from the crowd. He sneered and continued, "That's right. The Twin Stars brothers are more powerful than Qi Tian as a team. However, they aren't fighting as a team at the moment. These two idiots don't understand that they become extremely powerful when they attack together, but they're nothing if they attack separately." Qi Fifan had stated the truth. Even he could have killed them effortlessly if he were to fight with any one of them. The Twin Stars brothers were very ferocious when they fought as a team. Elites such as Yi Shiwen and Emperor Qin wouldn't be afraid even if they had to face two Heaven's Pride experts at once. This was so because 1 + 1 didn't necessarily mean 2. However, the Twin Stars brothers were different. They were twins. Their hearts were connected to each other. So, their collaborated attacks carried endless might. They had the means to be ranked among the top Heaven's Pride experts, and they were counted as one. However, these so-called powerful Twin Stars brothers were nothing more than an ordinary lamb when separated. Even Qi Fifan was quite powerful. He hadn't participated in this competition. However, his strength might not be less than that of Qin Wang. In fact, he was confident that he could compete against Emperor Qin if the man didn't use the spatial ability. He was unable to participate in the competition. However, he had been watching it since the beginning. He had confidence in Yi Shiwen. Only he had seen how Yi Shiwen had slaughtered 2 Heaven's Pride experts in a breath. One must understand that a Heaven's Pride expert was 100 times more heroic and powerful than a quasi-Heaven's Pride expert. Nobody could rival Yi Shiwen's aggressiveness, and he hadn't even displayed his entire strength so far. He could even find some means to deal with Emperor Qin. The 2 brothers realized that they couldn't deal with Yi Shiwen separately after they had faced his extremely powerful attack. They had tried to do so a moment ago, but they had soon understood that it didn't matter how high-handed they thought of themselves. They couldn't even withstand one blow his. Attack! Both the brothers let out huge roars in unison and decided to launch an attack at Yi Shiwen. However, how could Yi Shiwen let them succeed in their plan? He shot his fist towards Hui Qi to kill him. It seemed as if his fist would break down the world into pieces. A pair of strong, iron-like fists pounded towards him. His fist attack far more gorgeous than Hui Qi's fist attack from a moment ago, and it carried endless might. It then went straight towards Hui Qi for the kill. Hualan and Hui Qi had planned that they would attack Yi Shiwen first. However, they had lost their rhythm in confusion since Yi Shiwen had attacked first and had gained an upper hand as a result. Hui Qi could only resist Yi Shiwen's attack, so he shot a pair of red fists forward to face the incoming fist attack. Rumble! A huge explosion occurred. Those strong fists collided in the sky. The void had been shattered within a split second. The earth trembled endlessly, and the chaos leaked out. A dreadful force swept across and went swirling in the air. The mountains had been shattered and reduced to powder by the adverse shock waves. Crunch! A loud sound of breaking of bones sounded. Hui Qi's arms had been broken by Yi Shiwen. He screamed as the blood splashed out and the bone fragments swirled in the air. Bang! Hui Qi was sent flying by the explosion. He then crashed into the ground and opened a huge crack therein. Brother! Hualan looked at Yi Shiwen with his round and glaring eyes. He had already arrived in front of Yi Shiwen to attack by now. He launched a kick towards Yi Shiwen. His kick set off a monstrous power as it went towards Yi Shiwen's waist. Bang! Hualan kicked Yi Shiwen on his waist, but only the sound of the collision between metals echoed as a result. It seemed as if he had kicked an iron wall. He felt that his leg had gone numb. Everyone held their breath when they saw the scene. Yi Shiwen's body was far too strong. Even the body of some Heaven's Pride expert would have split into 2 halves by this kick of Hualan's. However, it couldn't even budge Yi Shiwen. Such strength was too horrifying. Yi Shiwen sneered. He regained his composure and shot his fist. Rumble! A loud sound of breaking of bones sounded along with a big explosion. Hualan's legs had been smashed by Yi Shiwen. His body also crashed into the ground, just like Hui Qi's. Yi Shiwen didn't stop. His aura began to boil. His body moved like a lightning, and he stamped his foot upon Hualan's body. Hualan's body collapsed under Yi Shiwen's attack. His body had been broken into 2 parts. Even the ground was disintegrated by this attack, and 2 huge chasms spread far away into the distance. It was an exceptionally terrifying spectacle. Hualan is dead. Everyone was dumbstruck. They had never dreamt that they'd see Yi Shiwen trample Hualan to death. They were more optimistic about Yi Shiwen than they were about these 2 brothers. However, they still felt that the Twin Stars brothers should have been able to hold their own against Yi Shiwen, even if Yi Shiwen was more powerful than them. They had anticipated that the Twin Stars brothers would be able to retreat even if they weren't as good as Yi Shiwen, and they would definitely go through a bloody battle before they succumbed to their deaths in the fight. People had expected that Yi Shiwen would have to face great difficulties in killing them, and there was also a possibility that he might get killed. Such expectations had been playing in their minds. However, Yi Shiwen's performance had undermined their imaginations. Yi Shiwen's fighting strength was far too tyrannical. No, rather than saying that Yi Shiwen was far too strong, it would be better to say that the twin Stars brothers' one wrong decision had ruined them. It had cost them their lives. Young brother! An intense, killing intention flashed in Huiqi's eyes. He was burning with rage. However, he had also been blasted into the ground. So he was also in a bad situation like his brother had been. And he too had nowhere to go. In fact, things had already gone out of his control. A massive hand, as big as the sky, covered him as it pounded upon him. Rumble! The big hand shattered the entire mountain and flattened the entire area. Huiqi also got annihilated by this attack. How's it possible? No. The lord of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall shouted in anger as he saw this scene. He suddenly stood up from his throne. He hadn't anticipated that Yi Shiwen would kill the twin Stars brothers. This had overturned his calculations and spoiled his plan. Suddenly, a figure stormed into the microcosm while everyone was still in shock. To be continued. Chapter 456. Everyone was shocked. They had been optimistic about the twin Stars brothers. In fact, the two brothers were the favorites to win this competition. However, they had been effortlessly killed by Yi Shiwen despite that. Such a battle had astonished everyone. It would have still been fine if the twin Stars brothers had been defeated. However, they shouldn't have lost so easily. This had completely undermined their expectations, to the extent that they couldn't accept this for a moment. It was already too late by the time the lord of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall shouted. Yi Shiwen wasn't going to stop anyway. Moreover, Yi Shiwen also knew that he couldn't recklessly interfere in the end. He could only watch in helplessness as Yi Shiwen killed the Xian Yuan twin stars. He looked bitterly at Yi Shiwen and then sat down in anger. This was the so-called "a murderer must be sentenced to death." It was hard to tell how many experts had died at the hands of the Xian Yuan twin stars, and they too would have wished for this if they had been in his place. It's unbelievable. Yi Shiwen has become the most terrifying expert in this competition. He possesses such frightening fighting strength. He had destroyed the offensive of the third ranked Qi Tian very effortlessly, and he had thoroughly defeated him in the end. And now he has effortlessly crushed the Xian Yuan twin Stars brothers. It's quite hard to describe his accomplishments in words. Someone spoke up in astonishment. Yeah, the Xian Yuan twin Stars brothers didn't even get the opportunity to collaborate. Each of them was far superior to an ordinary heavens pride expert, but they crumpled like paper in the hands of Yi Shiwen. In fact, they were gently crushed and thrown into the trash can. They couldn't pose any threat to Yi Shiwen. It can be said that they lost because they couldn't collaborate. However, does this mean that they could only defeat an opponent by relying on their numerical advantage? Were they only like a paper tiger if separated? Someone dared to open his mouth. Many people were praising these two rising stars of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall before the contest had started. However, such an outcome had made them sad. Therefore, they could only sigh with sorrow at this time. He. So, the Xian Yuan Palace Hall spent a hefty price and made it possible for these two individuals to fight as a team because they probably knew that these two were good for nothings on their own. They were merely like a pair of paper tigers. A true Martial University's disciple coldly laughed and said, "The Xian Yuan Palace Hall and the true Martial University could be described as arch-enemies among the four forces." So, true Martial University's prestige had risen because of such an outcome, while the Xian Yuan Palace Hall had lost their pride. How could this not get the disciples of the true Martial University excited? Especially when they were already quite enraged since the Xian Yuan twin Stars brothers had said so many insulting words to Yi Shiwen. Many disciples of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall were present around that disciple. They looked at each other with glaring eyes when they heard his words. It seemed as if they would attack him. However, They also found a considerable amount of ill expressions in the eyes of many disciples of the true martial university. So, they had no choice but to let their anger drop. Yi Shiwen is the biggest dark horse in this competition. He had become famous before the competition. He was ranked among the 8 heavens pride experts. However, nobody was optimistic about his victory before the competition had started. However, he has managed to reach this stage. This has undermined everyone's prediction. His next fight is with Emperor Qin. Can he be a match for Emperor Qin? I think it's difficult to say. He possesses incredible strength. His body is also extremely tyrannical. I've heard that he has also practiced a secret technique, so his restoration ability is very quick. Emperor Qin may not be able to deal with him. He can't deal with Emperor Qin. Emperor Qin's spatial ability has made him almost invincible in this competition. Everyone was still in shock. Meanwhile, a figure had stormed into the microcosm. Everyone looked on as that fierce figure arrived inside the microcosm. It turned out to be Emperor Qin. He was seated upright above the golden lion and looked impressive. He was clad in an armor and held a lance in his hand. He seemed like the reincarnation of a god of war, and it seemed as if he was showing his contempt for the entire world. He was staring at Yi Shiwen with his ice-cold eyes. His lance was making a buzzing sound. It seemed as if it was eager to drink fresh blood. He was motionless, but he was releasing ice-cold aura in the surroundings. This would make one feel as if one had fallen into an ice hole. His mount, that golden lion, was moving and roaring even more restlessly. Even Emperor Qin's roar was quite scary. Emperor Qin, what does he want to do? Does he want to interfere with the competition? Someone asked. Isn't he afraid of receiving the joint punishment from all the 4 forces? Someone was left baffled and had seemingly raised the question in anger. Insane. He's insane. What does he wish to achieve by intervening like this? Does he want to take the advantage of Yi Shiwen's present situation and kill him because he might be exhausted since his battle has ended a moment ago? Someone asked in fear. It's impossible. Emperor Qin is mistaken if he thinks so. Yi Shiwen has indeed killed 2 heavens pride experts. However, the Xian Yuan twin stars didn't reveal their entire strength. In fact, Yi Shiwen hasn't been affected greatly. He's not exhausted. His vitality is still surging. He has maintained his peak state. Emperor Qin may think that he can get an opportunity to kill Yi Shiwen, but that's impossible. Then why has Emperor Qin burst into the microcosm and disturbed the competition? The 4 forces must stop him. A disciple said. Certain rules had been established by the 4 forces as far as this competition was concerned, and these established rules were absolute. People could mess around and cause chaos if there were no rules. However, nobody was allowed to act recklessly once their rules had been established. Even the lords of the major forces could at most use their voice to interfere if they wanted to intervene, but they couldn't dare to contend against the rules. Yi Shiwen, do you dare to fight? Emperor Qin cast a glance at Yi Shiwen and challenged him. He looked at him disdainfully. I know that these 2 trashes didn't cause you much trouble, so you can fight right now. Of course, you can also choose to take rest if you're afraid. We will fight later in that case. A callous smile flashed through the corner of Emperor Qin's mouth as he looked at Yi Shiwen in a cold manner. It seemed as if he was certain that Yi Shiwen would agree to a fight at the moment. The spectators held their breath. Emperor Qin was extremely audacious. He had actually burst into the microcosm and had challenged Yi Shiwen for the fight. This was purely against the rules of this martial arts competition. The final fight for the championship had been set to take place on the final day. That day had been reserved for the finale. However, Emperor Qin wanted this fight to take place ahead of time. His actions had left everyone extremely surprised. It seemed as if these so-called rules didn't mean anything to him. He was using the goading method to indirectly force Yi Shiwen into a fight at this moment. However, the importance he was giving to Yi Shiwen was evident. He would never give so much importance to most people. Moreover, these two individuals were very special. Everyone had come to realize that these two had concealed their skills through the course of various fights. Nobody knew about the bottom line of their power because no one had been able to compel them to unleash their full strength so far. Moreover, they had effortlessly defeated the other heaven's pride experts as well. In fact, most people had also given up the idea of thinking too much about it. The fight between these two individuals was the biggest suspense of this martial arts competition, and everyone was still doubtful about the victor of the championship. The Supreme Lord of the True Martial University frowned as he saw this from the tall platform. He didn't like how Emperor Qin had broken the rule on a whim. He was about to berate him. However, he heard the voice of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall's lord before he could. The man spoke up in a mystifying manner. This young man is very courageous. I think that rules don't fit into the situation sometimes. The two of them will fight tomorrow anyway. It would be better if they fight right now and finish this competition. Everyone would finally get to see who is better among them that way. The Lord of the Muddy Sky Island looked at Xian Yuan Palace Hall's lord. He knew what his counterpart's intention was. The Xian Yuan Palace Hall's lord wanted both sides to engage in an utterly devastating struggle. It would be better if none of them would win. Then, both of them would forge a mortal enmity. And that would be the best outcome for the Xian Yuan Palace Hall's lord. The participants of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall had already died. So, he had nothing to do with this. Hence, it would be best for him if a deadly battle could erupt between these two. His intention obviously wasn't good. However, this matter involved a disciple of the Muddy Sky Island. So, he couldn't say much in this matter. After all, this rule of the martial arts competition had been made by the ancestors of these four forces. It had a very long history. Even these lords couldn't dare to break this rule. One must know that this competition would carry on for many times. It wasn't merely limited to this times. Other people could also randomly break the rules in the future if they would allow someone to break this rule here. And that would expose their own disciples to death traps in the future. They would suffer more loss than gains if this happened at this moment. Such rules meant nothing for people of their stature. In fact, these rules were less valuable than toilet paper to them. The key point was whether these rules were required or not. But it was evident that these major forces required such rules to protect their disciples. These rules would allow their disciples to compete and grow in a fair environment. The casualties of their disciples would increase if they messed up these rules. In fact, it could reach to such an extent that they wouldn't be able to bear the end result. This competition was mainly used to weaken each other's strength and to kill the other's immature Heaven's Pride level experts in their cribs. However, some extremely powerful contender had killed several Heaven's Pride experts on many occasions, and they've had to suffer huge losses as a result. So, the four forces had learned from their mistakes and had decided not to send all of their Heaven's Pride experts into the competition. And even the main objective of this competition had changed from strangling each other's geniuses to tempering one's own disciples. And that would also allow their disciples to mature more quickly. The arrangement of this level of competition at the appropriate time allowed the young experts to gain high-level battle experience, and that was something that they often couldn't on normal days. This was also the reason why many people would make breakthroughs right after the competition ended. They simply wanted to hone the skills of their disciples. They could accept the casualties to a certain extent. However, they couldn't bear large-scale damage. The Lord of the Fire Cloud Cave opened his mouth and spoke. I think that both of these individuals are pretty good. They are both full of vitality. However, that has nothing to do with shifting the fight to an earlier time. As for Emperor Chen's misconduct, I would like to say that the Muddy Sky Island must teach him a good lesson after he goes back home when the competition comes to an end. And I believe that the Muddy Sky Island wouldn't be swayed by personal affection towards him. Damn it! The talented, barbaric person who seems uneducated and uncouthly from the outside is actually turned out to be the most sinister one. His belly is full of schemes and crafty plots. The other three lords silently cussed in the secrecy of their hearts. To be continued. Chapter 457. Chapter 457. Fight until the world collapses. The Lord of the Fire Cloud Cave seemed impartial this time. However, his biased attitude in favor of Emperor Qin was almost clearly visible. It seemed as if this old guy still secretly held a grudge towards Yi Shiwen for killing Qi Tian. So, he wanted to cause trouble for Yi Shiwen. Perhaps there was an even deeper reason. Maybe he wanted both of them to lose. One must know that these two individuals possessed excessively tyrannical strength. They could easily defeat the Heaven's pride experts of the same generation. And this was too scary. It didn't matter who among these two individuals would win this competition, but the said victor would become the biggest threat for the younger generation of the other forces. Therefore, it would be best if they were to mutually wound or kill each other. The lords of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall and the Fire Cloud Cave obviously wanted this scenario to take place. The Lord of the Muddy Sky Island heard the words of the Lord of the Fire Cloud Cave. However, he didn't say anything, and that was rather unexpected. Perhaps these two lords had made such remarks out of good intentions. However, he also knew that these two lords didn't genuinely harbor any good intentions. In fact, they weren't nice people to begin with. But this decision was biased in favor of Emperor Qin nonetheless. Emperor Qin and Yi Shiwen had just fought their battles a few moments ago, but there was a difference of heaven and earth between their respective opponents. Emperor Qin's opponent was merely a quasi-heaven's pride expert. However, Yi Shiwen had faced two top heaven's pride experts. The results were same, and both of them had effortlessly defeated their opponents in no time. But Emperor Qin was the one to face the resentment of the public. After all, that quasi-heaven's pride expert of the true martial university couldn't possibly be compared with the Xian Yuan twin stars. However, he didn't feel grateful towards the other's two lords. His heart was already assured that Emperor Qin stood at the invincible position since he possessed the spatial ability. Moreover, Emperor Qin possessed tyrannical strength. In fact, his strength was beyond everyone's imagination. Therefore, he was expected to win smoothly. Even the incredible strength of Yi Shiwen would end up being useless in this case. In fact, it would be pointless since he couldn't even land an attack on Emperor Qin. He could only get thrashed by Emperor Qin and would lose sooner or later. There wasn't any suspense attached to this battle, so letting it take place at an earlier time would change nothing. Therefore, there was no need to treat it as a favor. The Supreme Lord of the True Martial University spoke up at this time. Let's see what he chooses. This choice must be put in the hands of Yi Shiwen. Emperor Qin's strength would also be useless if Yi Shiwen didn't agree to fight at this time. After all, he couldn't possibly contend against those extremely tyrannical great sage experts, could he? They would crush him to death within no time. Even his spatial ability wouldn't be of any use against them. They were skilled enough to rush over and kill him before he would get a chance to teleport away. Emperor Qin was coldly looking at Yi Shiwen. He looked arrogant and despotic. His monstrous aura had surged up significantly. It seemed as if he would attack Yi Shiwen and kill him right now. However, Yi Shiwen knew that Emperor Qin wouldn't dare to attack him. He would have to face the consequence if he attacked. The Supreme Lord would crush him into pieces. This was the ground reality. Yi Shiwen, do you dare to fight? Emperor Qin shouted solemnly. He was seated upright atop his mount in midair. He looked like a huge mountain and was giving off an enormous suppression force. I will buy you a ride to hell since you're in such a hurry to die. Yi Shiwen replied coldly. His fight with the Xian Yuan twin stars hadn't affected him in any way. He might have been under a big threat if they had collaborated. However, he had made the first strike and had gained an upper hand in the fight. He didn't even give them a chance to collaborate. He obviously got very less time to pull it off. However, he made good use of the available time and caught them off guard, and he managed to kill both of them as a result. Moreover, he also possessed the Phoenix regeneration technique. So, he didn't need to be afraid of successive fights. Emperor Qin was gravely mistaken if he thought that Yi Shiwen must be exhausted because of his previous battle, and that he could take advantage of it. In fact, that would be his doom. It didn't matter to Emperor Qin whether the fight would be preponed by a day or postponed by another. It was all the same to him. This fight had to take place sooner or later. However, he wanted this battle to take place as soon as possible so that he could settle the scores without any further delay. We can finally settle the grudges from our time on the Demon Island properly, Yi Shiwen solemnly added. What? Yi Shiwen agreed to fight with Emperor Qin? How's this possible? Isn't he afraid of losing because of exhaustion? Someone asked in disbelief. Yi Shiwen wanted to fight in this situation. There was no difference between this and deliberately getting one's head caught between doors as far as most people were concerned. Moreover, it seems that both these individuals have some past grudges. Demon Island, where is this place? Why does it sound familiar? Someone asked in a doubtful manner. I know about Demon Island. It's an island that opens once in every 50 years. And many young elites of the 10 countries of the Southeast region are summoned to this island. A disciple of the true Martial University explained. He had heard the legends of the Demon Island. So it's that Demon Island. I think it's a very strange place. It's said that many top experts of the younger generation have also stemmed from the Demon Island. However, the Demon Island Bell only summons the strongest geniuses of the Southeast region. Many people had deliberately rushed there even though they hadn't been summoned. And many of those experts located this strange place. There were several great sage experts among them too. However, they never returned from there. I didn't expect that these two individuals have already met each other on that Demon Island. So, both of them belong to Southeast region, that small region. Haha, it's ridiculous. Most outstanding disciples of the top forces of the southern region have come from the Southeast region. Many disciples had started to discuss about the Demon Island. Demon Island had a sinister reputation. It was even famous among the four forces. Many people had started to wonder that these two must have visited the Demon Island. So, they must have obtained some amazing treasures from there. After all, the Demon Island once used to be the burial place for gods, according to the legends. Even Emperor Chen's mount, that golden lion, had come from the Demon Island. Yi Shiwen was lean and skinny. However, he looked like the very incarnation of an ancient god at the moment. His golden divinities crawled over his entire body, and it seemed as if he was clad in a golden divine robe. The golden divinities condensed and surged forth as gigantic sea waves. These golden waves then smashed against the surrounding space and shattered it. Not bad. You're genuinely courageous. Emperor Chen sneered as he looked at Yi Shiwen. He knew that Yi Shiwen would accept his challenge. It was impossible that he wouldn't agree to fight. Yi Shiwen wasn't the kind of person who would refuse to fight. Emperor Chen had to admit that Yi Shiwen was like him, at least to some extent. Both of them were extremely rigid individuals. They would prefer to die, but they wouldn't bow their heads down. Both of them were extremely arrogant and despotic in other people's opinion. They would do everything on a whim. However, the only difference was that Emperor Qin looked arrogant and despotic from outside, while Yi Shiwen looked elegant and graceful. In fact, Yi Shiwen was a kind-hearted person on the inside, but people couldn't see his kindness from outside. However, he would reveal his despotic character if someone tried to provoke him. Who do you think you are? You think that you're invincible because you possess the spatial ability? Yi Shiwen coldly sneered and spoke. And, by the way, you're too inquisitive about other people's business. Who doesn't know why you've arrived so late to challenge? Isn't it because you couldn't defeat your opponent earlier? Yi Shiwen secretly mocked Emperor Qin and hinted at what had happened during their last meeting. Emperor Qin had wanted to save the 8th prince at that time, but he had been too late to save him from Yi Shiwen. Emperor Qin was well aware of what Yi Shiwen was hinting at. However, he didn't wish to argue with him on this matter, so he merely replied in a cold tone, "Your sharp tongue can't save your life. You can't handle my suppression." Emperor Qin added. An exceptionally murderous aura surged out from his body, and his golden lion suddenly charged towards Yi Shiwen. The golden lion's speed was extremely fast. It nearly drew a trail of golden afterimages in midair and arrived in front of Yi Shiwen within the blink of an eye. Incomparable speed shook the entire earth along with an endless amount of scary aura, and the energy waves swept out in all directions. Even the void got shattered as a result. It was an extremely frightening spectacle. Only strength will decide who will suppress whom. Yi Shiwen wasn't afraid of Emperor Qin. He rushed towards him. In fact, he seemed like an endless mountain of energy rolling over to crush Emperor Qin. Yi Shiwen summoned a Han seal at this moment. A huge mountain formed in the sky and swept down. Rumble! That mountain then smashed down at Emperor Qin's side. Emperor Qin let out a loud sonic boom, and the sonic waves crushed that huge mountain into fine powder. Yi Shiwen's pupil suddenly contracted. His face exposed a bit of solemn expression. His Han seal was the first form of the overturning the heaven seal. It was just the first type, but it still carried endless might. Emperor Qin's had shattered Yi Shiwen's Han seal with a loud shout. Something like this had happened for the first time. Emperor Qin was extremely tyrannical. In fact, he was nearly beyond his imagination, and this was the main reason why he considered Emperor Qin to be his biggest enemy in the younger generation. He had obviously given the most attention to Emperor Qin in this competition. That was because Emperor Qin posed a huge threat to him. Rumble! Both of them ferociously collided. It seemed as if two tyrannical and invincible gods had suddenly knocked against each other in the sky. The sky got shattered in an instant, and this collision set off energy waves which severed the surrounding space. It looked like the doomsday was upon. Both of them attacked each other once again, and without any hesitation. Yi Shiwen was fighting two enemies at one time since he was clashing with Emperor Qin and that golden lion at this time. The golden lion was merely a mount. However, its strength wasn't less than that of those top-level Heaven's Pride experts, so it was extremely difficult to deal with. However, Yi Shiwen didn't fall into a disadvantageous situation while he faced them. Thanks to that, he had immediately earned himself a whole new level of respect in the eyes of many people. After all, most people felt that it would be very difficult for Yi Shiwen to win this match. Emperor Qin possessed the spatial ability, and he was almost stationed at the invincible position. Moreover, Emperor Qin and his mount were equal to two top-tier Heaven's Pride experts, and they were far more tyrannical as a team than the Xian Yuan twin stars. They were fighting at a lightning-fast speed, and only left trails of afterimages behind them. They had already exchanged 1,000 strokes within a short time. Tyrannical shock waves overflowed in all directions as a result. Layer after layer of energy storms swept out. This scene was extremely tyrannical and could scare a person to death. Bang! Suddenly, an explosion occurred while they were engaged in this fast-paced battle. The microcosm couldn't withstand the intensity of their battle and shattered into pieces. To be continued. Chapter 458. Bang! The aftermath of the fight between these two individuals was too frightening. The entire microcosm had collapsed. The space has the ability to restore automatically. Many legendary-level experts could also rip the space apart. However, the torn space would automatically restore itself the very next second. It was impossible for them to damage it to such an extent that it couldn't self-recover. Not to mention, the bigger the world, the harder it is to destroy it. This was merely a microcosm. but these two had exploded it into small pieces. The fight between Yi Shiwen and Emperor Qin had reached a terrifying extent. Both of them possessed extremely tyrannical strength. Those two came out of the collapsing microcosm and landed in an arena that was located on top of the metropolis Marshall Peak. Rumble! The terrifying explosion set off a series of storms. The impact made a huge crater on that stage, even though it was made of strong jade. Everyone was dumbstruck when they saw this scene. They hadn't anticipated that the fight between these two individuals would be so incredible. The Xian Yuan twin stars brothers had also broken the microcosm. However, they hadn't been able to shatter it in its entirety. The microcosm had restored itself soon enough in that case. However, these two individuals had shattered the microcosm into pieces. This microcosm was less than 100 kilometers in range. However, it was still a world in its own. It wasn't that big and was only like a fragment of a world. But this microcosm had been shattered so thoroughly that it had failed to restore itself. Everyone was left in awe because of this. It could be said that they had nearly been scared to death. The experts of the younger generation had especially become even more frightened and apprehensive. After all, these experts and these two individuals belonged to the same generation. Therefore, they were very concerned about the strength of these two individuals. In fact, they had a premonition that the winner of this fight would mark the beginning of a new era. And these disciples might have to live under the shadow of the winner of this battle for a very long time. They secretly compared themselves with these two individuals. However, they realized that they wouldn't stand a chance if they were to exchange places with any one of these two. These two reached to the top of the public square of the metropolis Marshall Peak while fighting. The space on top of the metropolis Marshall Peak had been strengthened. Therefore, it was quite difficult for them to break open the space, even if they would attack with the entirety of their strength. In fact, only small cracks would appear even if they succeeded in breaking the space. However, the attacks of both of these individuals had still reached an intense and marvelous degree. None of the two was holding back one bit. "This is not fair," a disciple of Muddy Sky Island yelled. "The space above this metropolis Marshall Peak is restricted. So, it's not that easy to shuttle back and forth in this space. It has imposed an enormous restriction on Emperor Chen's spatial ability." He had barely made this remark when the disciples of the true Marshall University suddenly looked at him bitterly. "Damn it, this bastard is too shameless. Emperor Qin possesses spatial ability. Is that any fair? Then how's this unfair? He's talking such nonsense." "Die!" Emperor Chen roared, and the released sonic boom dissipated in all directions. His aura condensed into a pillar of energy. It then soared into the sky as it reached an extremely dreadful point. His golden lion let out a long and loud roar. It brandished its sharp claws and grabbed the air surrounding itself. An explosion occurred, and a vacuum region was consequently formed. The golden lion moved in a flash. It then suddenly arrived in front of Yi Shiwen to attack. Yi Shiwen's eyes flashed as soon as he realized that the movement of the golden lion had been much slower this time than it had been a moment ago. It hadn't used its instant teleportation ability a moment ago, but there was no doubt that it had used a certain portion of its spatial ability. Its speed had reached a terrifying level, thanks to its natural affinity for space. It was as fast as the lightning. Therefore, it was impossible for an average person to respond because the golden lion was moving too fast. Fortunately, it was Yi Shiwen, and he was able to react in time. Whoosh! Suddenly, a pair of golden wings stretched open behind Yi Shiwen. What kind of wings were these? They had spread far and wide, and had blotted out the sky like golden clouds. Everyone was stunned when they saw this scene. In fact, most people's first reaction was, "Yi Shiwen is a devil." It was impossible for someone to bring out such terrifying wings. Only the devil race could do this. Many human experts could fly, but flying was one thing, and using wings to fly was another. However, Several people also noticed it was some kind of magical power. This pair of wings wasn't made of flesh. Rather, it was made up of energy. Moreover, this energy was rather intrepid and could scare a person to death. What kind of magical ability is this? How can it be so frightening? These wings were sweeping out waves of golden divinities each time they flapped, and those golden waves blotted out the sky and covered the earth as they swept across. Moreover, wind and thunder erupted every time these huge wings flapped. It was like a precursor of a rainstorm's arrival. Yi Shiwen had already practiced his devil wings to an extremely profound level. Moreover, he had also touched upon the principle of flight since he had entered the semi-sage realm. An ordinary legendary expert couldn't contend against a semi-sage expert. It was impossible, and the reason was that a semi-sage expert had touched upon the principles, and the principle of flight was also one of them. The agility skill of semi-sage realm was also at a very high level. Semi-sage experts could tread on the flight principle. So, a legendary expert simply couldn't match their speed. Yi Shiwen had managed to catch up with the speed of a semi-sage expert when he used to be in legendary realm, thanks to his devil wings. Otherwise, it would have been impossible to pull that off. He had also touched upon this principle after he had entered the semi-sage realm. His understanding of this flight principle had climbed up by a level sometime later. He had then come to realize what a terrifying magical ability these devil wings were in reality. Just like Phoenix regeneration technique, the devil wings was also a magical technique that hadn't reached an advanced stage yet. It would be considered as an extremely powerful technique once it would be in its true form. It'd be genuinely difficult to deal with thereafter. In fact, Yi Shiwen had been able to use it quite easily and freely even when he used to be weak. The only difference between now and then was in the magnitude of its might. Consequently, the devil wings would become more and more terrifying as his understanding of the principles deepened. Moreover, it had risen sharply. Yi Shiwen's understanding of principles had burst forth significantly when he had entered the semi-sage realm after having condensed 1,000 Tao principles. And this change had also reflected in his devil wings. Initially, his wings could only help him accelerate while he'd fly. However, his wings had also wielded the power of wind and thunder at this stage. His wings could even split an ordinary semi-sage expert into two halves as a result. This was the result of the understanding of wind and thunder. And he had gained this understanding after having crossed the heavenly tribulation several times. He had then integrated his own comprehension of wind and thunder into the devil wings. In fact, this had been his first attempt to modify the devil wings by adding his own comprehension to them. Yi Shiwen had undergone closed-door training in order to modify his devil wings after he had returned from the lair of the wind dragon, and he had modified them a little bit in order to add some functions to them. However, it was an entirely new step for him. This clearly showed that his comprehension of the principles had reached an entirely new level. His previous understanding of principles hadn't even reached the end of the devil wing's functions. Forget about the stage of modification. Devil wing was a magical ability that was already in its highest form. It had already reached perfection in a way. So, it was quite difficult to modify it. However, making slight modifications to it was comparatively easier. Even so, Yi Shiwen had to use up more than 2 million primary spirit dawn for that. Yi Shiwen looked like a devil god at this time. His devil wings were fluttering, and it seemed as if the clouds were thundering and were letting him stay afloat in the sky. Flap! An enormous lightning fell from the sky, and it compelled Emperor Qin and his golden lion to retreat. Crash bang! Yi Shiwen's devil wings were flapping unceasingly and were sweeping out wind and thunder. Then the lightning began to seethe within this tempest. It then began to revolve around Yi Shiwen. Soon, it seemed as if he was standing in an ocean of lightning. Emperor Chen's complexion had turned gloomy. He hadn't anticipated that Yi Shiwen could be so tyrannical. The battle had become increasingly intense, and Yi Shiwen had gradually started to reveal his hidden abilities. But Emperor Qin hadn't anticipated this scenario earlier. Perhaps he had never thought that Yi Shiwen could be such a tough opponent. In fact, his mind still had the image of the Yi Shiwen he had met on the Demon Island. He would have already fought with Yi Shiwen and would have already killed him if Qing Su hadn't interfered. He didn't feel anything different at the beginning of the competition. He wasn't afraid, even though Yi Shiwen had progressed rather quickly. He believed that he was the strongest. After all, he had the spatial ability. In fact, who would come forward to say that they were at the first if Emperor Qin were to say that he himself was at the second rank? He didn't possess the spatial ability himself. His golden lion did. However, what difference would it make? They had always been a team. Sure enough, everyone had suddenly become optimistic about him after he had displayed the spatial ability. The Xian Yuan twin stars were everyone's favorites for winning this competition at first. However, that had changed after his rise. In fact, they had become totally unworthy of a mention. However, he hadn't felt a shred of pride at this. This was inevitable in his opinion. This was a matter of fact. In fact, the Xian Yuan twin stars brothers were two pieces of trash in his opinion. He merely thought of Yi Shiwen as a scourge that he hadn't been to get rid of earlier. He genuinely never considered Yi Shiwen his rival, and this had been his thought process until now. However, his thinking changed after he saw Yi Shiwen's current avatar and found out how dreadful he truly was. It was entirely different from the image of Yi Shiwen he had in his mind from back then. He had no choice but to force himself to not get nervous so that he could respond calmly. Flap, flap, flap. Yi Shiwen's huge golden wings were fluttering crazily. Wind and thunder were sweeping across like a rampaging dragon. It seemed as if a rainstorm was about to arrive. Endless thunderstorms gathered and began to pour down towards Emperor Qin from above, just like raindrops. Bang! The wind and thunder pounded on that golden lion. It struck on its body and charred a portion it. The golden lion didn't sustain serious injuries as a result of this attack. However, the force of the lightning had left its body a bit numb. It became sluggish for a short moment as a result of this. However, that short moment was enough for Yi Shiwen. The wind and thunder were present everywhere in the sky, and they suddenly pounded on the golden lion upon Yi Shiwen's command. Bang! 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 An endless rain of heavenly thunders poured upon the bodies of the golden lion and Emperor Qin, and the impact thereof had left them in a difficult situation. To be continued. Chapter 459. These wind and thunderstorms had arrived in a huge quantity. They weren't too powerful. However, the quantity was extremely huge. In fact, they seemed like a torrential downpour. The golden lion's speed was very high. It appeared like a golden lightning as it moved. However, the problem was that the scope of Yi Shiwen's stretched devil wings was too broad. In fact, they were like two huge golden clouds. Emperor Qin and the golden lion were unable to get out of its range in such a short period of time as a result. So, they were forced in a somewhat difficult situation. They didn't sustain severe injuries. However, this had left them extremely depressed. Suddenly, two golden lights flashed. Yi Shiwen finally opened his eyes. Then a loud and sharp-piercing schwa sound reverberated out of the blue, and he moved into action. And he disappeared in front of everyone's sight as a result. People suddenly lost sight of Yi Shiwen as soon as this scene blossomed before their eyes. They had to condense their real elemental energy in their eyes to enhance their vision. However, they were barely able to see his afterimage. Even then, bang! Yi Shiwen pressed down his palm. It pounded upon Emperor Qin, but it seemed as if a mountain was smashing down from the sky. Rumble. Emperor Qin's movement wasn't slow either. In fact, he was even quicker than the golden lion. He promptly turned around, and shot his lance upward to face the incoming attack. Bang! Yi Shiwen's palm and Emperor Chen's lance collided. The sound of the collision of metals sounded. Everyone was so scared upon witnessing this scene that they almost fell down from their seats. Everyone knew that Emperor Chen's lance was a sage tool. In fact, it was strong to pierce the void. It was exceptionally terrifying. It could even stab a sage expert to death. However, a sound of collision between iron and gold had resounded when it collided with Yi Shiwen's palm. This indicated that Yi Shiwen's body was intrepid to the point of exaggeration. He had failed to break this lance into pieces, but his flesh had still managed to counterbalance the incredible might of this sage tool. Such kind of a body was intrepid beyond any limits. He possessed such kind of a body. How could anybody be his opponent? Speed, strength, and physical toughness. He had perfected these attributes to the peak. It was sufficient to place him at the top among his peers. After all, Emperor Chen was ranked at the top because of his spatial ability. Moreover, everyone had also witnessed Yi Shiwen's incredible speed. They could only see his figure on occasions, even though they had enhanced their visions. Moreover, his physical toughness was so tyrannical that it had left them stunned. After all, his body could be compared with a sage tool. He had clashed head-on with a sage tool. Such bodily strength had left everyone in awe. Moreover, it was of pivotal importance to note that he also possessed insane strength. His attack had barely touched Emperor Chen's body, but the man's arm was still left to tremble from the shock. It was evident that this attack had left a decent effect on him. It could be said that Yi Shiwen's slap would have broken all the bones in the body of an average person, and would have left the said person unable to stand up. Many people realized that Emperor Chen's body was also extremely tyrannical. They hadn't realized it earlier. They were only attracted to his spatial ability before. His spatial ability had obscured everything else. However, one couldn't blame the others since he himself was dazzled by this spatial ability alone. He felt that many of his own characteristics and skills had become insignificant in front of this spatial ability. Everyone else seemed to think so as well. It wasn't that they thought that he didn't possess any other skill. However, his spatial ability was too amazing. However, his collision with Yi Shiwen had made them realize that his body was also extremely tyrannical. One must keep in mind that Yi Shiwen had defeated the barbarian god's real body, Qi Tian, at a lightning speed. This fight had confused them even more. After all, both of the individuals were insanely powerful. What kind of magical power is this? An extreme greedy look flashed in the eyes of the lord of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall when he saw Yi Shiwen's huge wings. His high cultivation level had allowed him to read Yi Shiwen's movements rather clearly. He had surpassed the great sage realm. So, ordinary magical powers and martial art techniques were unlikely to attract his attention. However, Yi Shiwen's devil wings had made him excited. He could tell that Yi Shiwen's magical power was truly outstanding. In fact, it had increased Yi Shiwen's speed to such a terrifying extent that many sage experts couldn't match his current speed. Fortunately, his opponent was a tyrannical expert like Emperor Chen. He also possessed extremely fast speed. Otherwise, it would have been a child's play for Yi Shiwen to kill an ordinary person at his current speed. Therefore, this lord's speed would also advance by leaps and bounds if he could get hold of this magical power. Even his strength would increase enormously if that were to happen. The lord of the Fire Cloud Cave was keeping a close eye on Yi Shiwen's body. Several people had been stunned when they had seen how Yi Shiwen had tackled the sage tool. Even an expert like him was no exception, despite the fact that he had surpassed the great sage realm. And that's because he had come to realize that Yi Shiwen's body was probably more tyrannical than the barbarian god's real body. Moreover, it wasn't a question of the disparity in martial power. He knew that one couldn't possibly clash with a sage tool while still being at semi-sage realm. In fact, even the most frightening barbarian god's real body couldn't achieve this feat. Someone had once tried to break a sage tool with bare hands after they had become a sage expert. However, that had happened a long time ago. He had always taken that to be a mere legend. However, he had come to realize that there's always someone out there who's better. Similarly, Yi Shiwen's cultivated body was probably more tyrannical than the barbarian god's real body. He got very excited as he realized this. One must know that these southern barbarian forces had risen to influence by relying on their strong physiques. And the possession of such an extremely powerful body meant that Yi Shiwen must also possess some kind of a secret body technique. And this had attracted his attention far more than the devil wings ever could. He might rise above all others in the ensuing war among southern barbarian forces if he could obtain such a body. One needed to pay a huge price to cultivate the barbarian god's real body. Moreover, one would also require the flaming sun real water. But it seemed like Yi Shiwen must have faced far lesser difficulties. After all, it was evident that Yi Shiwen had cultivated his body to such an extent on his own. And that trace of astonishment on the face of the Supreme Lord of the true martial university had made this fact overly obvious. This meant that even he didn't know anything about Yi Shiwen's physique. Therefore, Yi Shiwen must have cultivated this physique on his own. Yi Shiwen had cultivated such a physique alone. So this lord would be able to nurture several people with physiques like Yi Shiwen's if he were to put the entire resources of the Fire Cloud Cave into cultivating physiques. And that would easily make up for the loss of Qi Tian's talent. Both these individuals had revealed their hidden abilities in this fight. For example, Emperor Chen's tyrannical body had unexpectedly got exposed. In addition, Yi Shiwen had never revealed such incredible speed and astonishing magical abilities in the past. Even the people of their own sex didn't know that they possessed such abilities. It's instinctual for people to keep their secret abilities hidden until they are forced to reveal. Their opponents hadn't been able to compel them to display their full potential so far. Perhaps it could be said that they didn't feel the need to use their hidden powers. However, they had unleashed their powers without any hesitation in the face of tyrannical experts like each other. Bang! 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 Yi Shiwen was extremely fast. He appeared like a golden flash to the eyes of the spectators. In fact, his speed would increase beyond unimaginable proportions whenever he'd flap his huge wings. He continued to attack Emperor Chen in order to kill him. It seemed as if every palm attack of his could break the heavens. Emperor Chen didn't get the time to breathe in the face of Yi Shiwen's quick and heavy attacks. In fact, it could be said that he had become tired of running for his life to no end. It wasn't that Emperor Chen wasn't enough tyrannical. Rather, Yi Shiwen was far too powerful. Everyone felt that everything about Yi Shiwen had become tyrannical to an astonishing level, whether it was his strength, speed, or physical toughness. He could kill a Heaven's Pride expert in one slap with such tyrannical body. He wouldn't even need to use his real elemental energy for that. Yi Shiwen's speed had reached the extreme after he had launched the devil wings. In fact, the speed of lightning wasn't enough to describe his current speed. An average person couldn't even see him. In fact, even Emperor Chen could barely see him. He could somehow keep up, but that too with great difficulty. Emperor Chen was able to react. However, he couldn't match Yi Shiwen's speed. Therefore, he had no option but to watch as Yi Shiwen assumed complete the control. He had no way to counter Yi Shiwen's attacks. His body wasn't strong enough to contend against Yi Shiwen head-on. It was only strong enough to prevent itself from getting smashed in a moment's time. The spectators with discerning eyes could see that Yi Shiwen would kill Emperor Chen if the fight continued like this. Yi Shiwen is extremely ferocious. Who could have thought that he would possess such abilities? Whether it's speed, strength, or body, it seems that he has grasped all the magical power techniques. And these techniques are extremely difficult to understand in reality. How can he be so ferocious? How many adventures has he been on? Yeah, Even I was very optimistic about Emperor Qin earlier. After all, he possesses the spatial ability. However, I didn't expect that things would turn out like this. Yi Shiwen has completely suppressed him under his attacks. Emperor Qin is no match for him. Such strength was extremely tyrannical. It was too scary. Many believed that Emperor Qin's strength was also extremely tyrannical and had no limits. In fact, his body and speed were both high-handed. Qin Huang didn't have any power to fight back when he had faced the repeated offensives, and he had gotten killed in the end. Therefore, Emperor Qin could be ranked at the top of the younger generation. However, such an expert had been suppressed by Yi Shiwen. In fact, the man didn't even have the power to fight back. That's quite normal. Emperor Qin possesses tyrannical strength. However, he was mainly depending on his spatial ability, and that's the reason why he hadn't revealed his true strength in the past. It doesn't matter how tyrannical Yi Shiwen is, he wouldn't have been able to match Emperor Qin's speed if Emperor Qin had revealed his spatial ability inside the microcosm. In fact, Emperor Qin wouldn't have been the one getting suppressed at this moment if that had come to happen. Rather, Yi Shiwen would have been the one getting suppressed. And Yi Shiwen's tyrannical strength would have been of no use if that scenario had unfolded. Damn it! How can this Yi Shiwen be so lucky? This is simply despicable. Yi Shiwen would have been like a feather in front of Emperor Qin's spatial ability if the space of the metropolis Martial Peak wasn't so strongly strengthened. A disciple of Muddy Sky Island complained in a rather unreconciled manner. To be continued. Chapter 460. The disciples of the other forces became somewhat speechless. They looked at this disciple of the Muddy Sky Island. Emperor Qin's superiority wasn't enough for him because the environment had suddenly become unfavorable for him. The situation was the same for the both of them. Emperor Qin had been restricted. However, it wasn't as if Yi Shiwen hadn't been restricted. He too couldn't attack extravagantly. However, everyone had no choice but to admit that this situation was too advantageous for Yi Shiwen. The restrictions had been imposed on both of them, but Emperor Qin's spatial ability had been restricted. There was also a restriction on Yi Shiwen, but it wasn't very evident. This hadn't been seen as that overwhelming of a change in the beginning. However, nobody had anticipated that Yi Shiwen would possess such terrifying magical power, and that his speed would increase to the pinnacle, and that too at a time when Emperor Qin's speed had been restricted to a great degree. Yi Shiwen's speed had increased significantly. Therefore, the restrictions of this space had turned out to be a good thing for Yi Shiwen. Lucky? Is this merely just good luck? A true martial university's disciple spoke up with disdain. Didn't you pay attention to Yi Shiwen's wisdom in battle? He didn't give the Twin Stars brothers any chance to collaborate when he had fought them, and he eventually stunned everyone by killing them quickly. Therefore, the contest, which was supposed to be a bitter struggle, transformed into a one-sided battle, and he has shattered the microcosm this time. Is it a case of Yi Shiwen's good luck or Emperor Qin's bad luck? Is it that simple? Can't it be possible that Yi Shiwen might have planned to drag him to the metropolis Martial Peak for the real fight? This true martial university disciple had spoken of another possibility. Everyone held their breath as they heard this. Yi Shiwen's planning ability had transcended everyone's imagination if this disciple was correct. He had thought of a good way to deal with the adverse situation in the midst of this fast-paced battle. He had transformed an unfavorable situation into a favorable one as a result, and he would be considered dreadful if he had pre-planned this. Who could match such battle wisdom? Of course, they didn't know that the restricted space had also affected Yi Shiwen. The principle of flight employed by his devil wings was very different from that of a bird's principle of flight. He must manipulate the principle of flight, but he must also do the same with the principle of space. The principle of space was also a very important part. He couldn't possibly maneuver around at such speeds in the air without manipulating the principle of space. The restriction on the spatial ability had turned out to be a big disaster for Emperor Qin. However, it didn't cause a small effect on Yi Shiwen either. Yi Shiwen had planned to go all out while he'd compete against Emperor Qin. The opposite party could teleport away in a flash, but Yi Shiwen had his plans to deal with him. However, it suddenly seemed as if his plans weren't needed. It had become a lot easier to surround and kill Emperor Qin in this scenario. He didn't care whether it was fair or unfair to Emperor Qin. He didn't think about these things. Only an idiot would think about fair and unfair things in the middle of a battle. A lot of things in this world were unfair. For example, Emperor Qin had challenged him to a fight without considering the fact that he had fought against the twin star's brother a moment ago. Emperor Qin had forced him to fight without caring about whether it was fair or unfair. So, he could go to hell if he wanted to complain about the unfairness of the situation. Yi Shiwen's eyes were only fixed on Emperor Qin at the moment. He wanted to kill Emperor Qin. He believed that Emperor Qin wouldn't have let go of a chance such as this to kill him. Inverting ocean seal. Yi Shiwen's shout gave rise to a sonic boom. Suddenly, endless water drops appeared in the sky behind Emperor Qin. The water droplets condensed into a vast ocean-like blue seal and pounded towards Emperor Qin. Bang! Emperor Qin didn't get the time to react, and this attack pounded on his body. His hands had already become numb after having fought for so long. They weren't as flexible as before. They had been rendered lifeless by the shocks caused by Yi Shiwen's attacks during the course of fight. Emperor Qin's armor got shattered into small pieces. This water-based attack had seemed feeble at first, but it had condensed to form an extremely mighty attack. It had broken his armor, and it had also badly injured his body. His flesh had been ruptured, and blood had started to splash out. His bones had also been exposed. In fact, he had nearly been crushed to death by Yi Shiwen. What? Emperor Qin has sustained injuries? Everyone was startled. Emperor Qin had been suppressed and forced into a disadvantageous position by Yi Shiwen. However, being suppressed and sustaining injuries were completely different things. He had merely been suppressed by Yi Shiwen until this moment. However, he still had enough strength to hold his own. But he had now sustained injuries. Such deep injuries indicated vulnerability and the beginning of an inevitable defeat. That's because these injuries would affect Emperor Qin's ability to react. The regeneration pace of Yi Shiwen's Phoenix regeneration technique was extremely fast. However, it still required some time to heal the injuries in moments of vulnerability times. Yi Shiwen would inevitably have his weak moments in the future. His Phoenix regeneration technique would certainly shorten his vulnerable moments to the minimum. However, that short period of time would be enough for some top-tier expert to give a decisive blow to him. However, Emperor Qin's secret healing technique wasn't as good as Yi Shiwen's. Therefore, this time period was enough for Yi Shiwen to gain an upper hand and give him a fatal blow. Emperor Qin, there is nothing left for you to say. It's time for your death. I will send you on your way to the afterlife. Yi Shiwen laughed and spoke. He couldn't help but laugh out loud when he saw that his biggest enemy was about to die at his hands. He had burst into laughter because of this strange and carefree feeling. In fact, he was dripping with delight. He suddenly had an illusion. He felt as if he was going to make a breakthrough. People are often unable to make breakthroughs. This isn't limited to the fact that the accumulation of energy isn't enough. Instead, it's mainly because of the shackles on their spirits. This is the so-called case of the dilemma of the person who has his will shattered by someone. And this shackles that person's spirit. These shackles are usually invisible, but they appear when the said person confronts that someone again. And these invisible shackles strongly bind the said person when that happens. Yi Shiwen had been afraid of Emperor Qin since that time on the Demon Island, and his spirit had been shackled by the invisible shackles of Emperor Qin ever since. Generally, it's quite difficult for people to perceive these shackles. However, it is extremely dangerous. It can even evolve into the inner demons within one's heart and might also obstruct one's cultivation thereafter. However, such shackles were also good since having inner demons was considered a good thing, but only as long as one was capable of eradicating them in the future. One would then have a broad view of the world, but only as long as these shackles had been obliterated. They would get the same feeling that a blindfolded person gets when their blindfold is suddenly removed from over their eyes. Yi Shiwen perceived the same kind of feeling at this moment. His cultivation hadn't made a breakthrough for a long time, but he could faintly feel the signs of making a breakthrough at this moment. It was true that the quickest way to make a breakthrough was during a combat. Yi Shiwen was laughing loudly, but he had become even more cautious. The closer one reaches to victory, the more one needs to be cautious. He wouldn't wish to lose the upper hand and suffer an unexpected defeat in the end. Such experience would be too hard to bear. An inverting ocean seal condensed on top of Yi Shiwen's hand and swept down towards Emperor Chen and the Golden Lion. It blotted out the sky and covered the earth as it pounded upon them. It seemed as if this attack would kill Emperor Chen. Emperor Chen and the Golden Lion were sent flying by the attack. However, they also got the opportunity to get away from Yi Shiwen's attack range. They finally got the time to respite as a result. Roar! The Golden Lion roared loudly. It opened its mouth like a sacrificial bowl. A seemingly endless amount of energy fluctuated inside its mouth. It transformed into a huge golden beam of light and shot towards Yi Shiwen. Then it collided with the inverting ocean seal. Rumble! The collision emitted dazzling rays of light and formed a ball of energy that exploded into a giant mushroom cloud. This mushroom cloud then rose up from the place of the collision. This collision was like an atomic eruption and had crushed the surrounding ground into fine powder. That beam of light had gotten crushed between the ground and Yi Shiwen's inverting ocean seal and had burst into golden rays of light that had filled the entire sky. However, the seal had continued to sweep down from above. Rumble! It pounded on the public square and smashed open a massive crater. The spectators couldn't help but gasp. The space on top of the metropolis Marshall Peak had been strengthened countless times. In other words, everything within the confines of this peak must have been strengthened several times. Moreover, that the public square was made up of solid jadestone. It had also been protected with top-tier barrier formations. However, Yi Shiwen's inverting ocean seal had opened a huge crater in it. The terrifying might of the inverting ocean seal was clearly visible. A person probably wouldn't survive this attack, even if he were to have 9 lives to achieve this feat. This seal technique was absolutely dreadful. They had never seen such a terrifying seal technique. It seemed as if a god had imparted this technique. Everyone understood what kind of attack Emperor Chen had just faced. Even a top expert like him didn't have the power to fight back when faced with Yi Shiwen's attack, since he was battered and exhausted. So he didn't have any way out. It wasn't that Emperor Chen was too weak. Rather, Yi Shiwen was far too powerful. Whereas Emperor Chen... Smoke and dust had scattered. Sharp-sighted people tried, but couldn't spot Emperor Chen. It seemed as if he had disappeared into thin air. Yi Shiwen's attack was very terrifying. However, it couldn't have annihilated Emperor Chen on an atomic level after having struck him. The remains of his body must have remained still. However, they couldn't see any trace of him at the moment. Even his Golden Lion had disappeared without a trace. Yi Shiwen felt that his attack hadn't actually hit Emperor Chen. In fact, he had clearly felt a spatial fluctuation and had felt that Emperor Chen had teleported away. How's this possible? He can use his teleportation ability here as well. Yi Shiwen was kind of terrified in his heart. He didn't know how Emperor Chen had escaped. Had he been able to use his spatial ability even in this situation? However, Yi Shiwen had become even more vigilant because Emperor Chen might appear at any place if he could use his spatial ability here. And this was extremely dangerous for Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen condensed his real elemental energy in his eyes and opened his discernment vision. He was paying absolute attention to spot any fluctuations in the surrounding space. He had also swept out his divine sense. So, he was prepared to sense Emperor Chen's presence anywhere and anytime. Yi Shiwen, it's over now! An ice-cold and merciless voice resounded. To be continued. Chapter 461. Yi Shiwen, it's over now! An ice-cold voice said in a ruthless manner as a figure suddenly appeared behind Yi Shiwen. Emperor Chen was seated upright on the golden lion. His lance pierced the vast sky like a dragon. It issued a shrill, piercing sound as it swept towards Yi Shiwen's back, and it seemed as if it would pierce his heart. Emperor Chen's body didn't look in a miserable condition anymore. It was evident that his injuries had recovered in this short period of time. Yi Shiwen had never thought that he would accidentally obtain a secret technique, such as the Phoenix regeneration technique. Similarly, his opponent had also had his own share of adventures. So, he must also have obtained an extremely marvelous healing technique, even if it wasn't as good as the Phoenix regeneration technique. This was bad for Yi Shiwen in this situation. Who would be able to kill Emperor Chen if he could go into hiding to heal his injuries? In fact, it wouldn't be incorrect to say that he was almost standing at the position of invincibility because of his spatial ability. He was very troublesome. The spatial ability was possessed by the Golden Lion, not him. However, what difference would it make? Yi Shiwen had racked his brain to come up with a strategy in order to drag Emperor Chen to the public square of the metropolis Martial Peak. Wasn't had meant to restrict Emperor Chen's spatial ability? That's correct. The fact is that breaking the microcosm was also one of his strategies. Otherwise, Yi Shiwen would have been in an extremely disadvantageous situation in front of an opponent like Emperor Chen, who possessed the spatial ability. Yi Shiwen could also shuttle back and forth in the space if his devil wings had been perfected to the top layer. However, that was a matter for the future. Yi Shiwen wanted to practice the devil wings to such an extent that he could break through the bindings of space at will. However, he still had to go a long way to achieve that. He didn't have any way to deal with Emperor Chen's spatial ability at the moment. Restricting Emperor Chen's spatial ability was very necessary for him because this fight might turn into a bitter struggle if he couldn't do that. He was confident that Emperor Chen couldn't kill him. Therefore, it would become an extremely long confrontation if he couldn't kill Emperor Chen either. He didn't wish for this to happen. He believed that Emperor Chen must be thinking of killing him. So, why mustn't he try to kill Emperor Chen as well? Therefore, he must think of a method to kill Emperor Chen. Only then would he be at ease. Yi Shiwen had planned how he would face Emperor Chen before this unexpected fight had begun. He had never looked down on his opponent, unlike Emperor Chen had. In fact, Yi Shiwen hadn't taken him lightly. Relatively speaking, he was more wary of Emperor Chen than Emperor Chen was of him. Emperor Chen had never looked him eye to eye before this battle. He had always looked down on Yi Shiwen. However, Yi Shiwen considered Emperor Chen as his biggest enemy in the present generation, and his valuation of Emperor Chen had increased further when Emperor Chen had revealed the spatial ability. Yi Shiwen had thought of many ways to restrict Emperor Chen's spatial ability. However, he couldn't find any concrete method. After all, he wasn't a great sage expert. The great sage experts could reinforce the surrounding space to stop the enemy from coming closer to them. So, Yi Shiwen eventually thought of a method and dragged Emperor Chen to the public square of the metropolis Martial Peak. The conflagration of this battle had been brought down to the main world. Things would become extremely simple for Yi Shiwen if he could restrict Emperor Chen's spatial ability. Then, even the tyrannical Emperor Chen wouldn't be a match for him. Everything so far had happened as per his expectations. Emperor Chen had become like a crippled person. One could say that one of his arms had been broken since his spatial ability had been restricted. He could only resist Yi Shiwen's attacks as a result. However, he didn't have the power to fight back. And he wasn't a match for Yi Shiwen when it came to real strength. Yi Shiwen had condensed 1,000 Tao principles. Emperor Qin wasn't far behind him, but there was a difference of heaven and earth between their strengths. Yi Shiwen had reached perfection in the semi-sage realm. However, things that happened afterwards had gone beyond his expectation. "Emperor Chun has appeared!" someone shouted in alarm. It seemed as if this person had already seen Yi Shiwen getting hit in advance, and blood had already splashed out of his body thereafter. Emperor Chen's sudden appearance, after having disappeared suddenly a while ago, had stunned everyone. He could travel back and forth in the space of the metropolis Marshall Peak. This ability was far too terrifying. Yi Shiwen is screwed. Nobody can be a match for our Emperor Qin since he has regained his spatial ability. Yi Shiwen is nothing more than a trash before him as matters stand. A Muddy Sky Island's disciple burst into laughter and spoke. They had become quite depressed when they had seen Yi Shiwen unceasingly suppress Emperor Qin. However, they suddenly burst into laughter as they saw Emperor Chen's counterattack. Clang! A loud sound of the collision of iron and gold metal resounded along with an explosion. But blood hadn't splashed out of Yi Shiwen's body as everyone had previously imagined. Rather, he had avoided danger at the most crucial moment with a sudden thrust of his palm. His palm transformed into a huge dragon claw and went up to face that sage-level lance. Rumble! The collision between the two sides had seemed like the collision between two megastars. It was the kind of clash that would leave both sides shattered. A huge explosion occurred along with the emission of boundless rays of light. Endless blast waves and energy storms swept out in all directions. Everything in a vast range had been annihilated by this blast. Even the air wasn't an exception to this. It was an extremely dreadful scene. Clang! Suddenly a sword's cry resounded. A huge long sword suddenly appeared in Yi Shiwen's hand. The sword energy soared in the sky. It swept across boundless divine beams and suddenly pounded towards Emperor Qin to chop him. Bang! This long sword cut apart that boundless storm and struck Emperor Qin. Poof! Blood splashed out from Emperor Chen's body and rose 300 feet in the air. He snorted painfully and disappeared before everyone's eyes. Everyone had been holding their breath since the moment Emperor Qin had appeared, and they finally let out their breath when they saw Emperor Qin disappear again. The sounds of inhaling and exhaling resounded everywhere as a result. Everything had been said long ago. However, all this had happened in a flash. Everyone had held their breath the moment Emperor Qin had suddenly appeared. This was because they had anticipated that Emperor Qin would pierce Yi Shiwen's heart and insta-kill Yi Shiwen, just like he had done with Qin Wang. After all, Qin Wang's strength wasn't bad either. However, he had been defeated instantly. Emperor Qin hadn't spent a bit of his strength, but had managed to defeat him in a moment. And this had left a deep impression in everyone's heart. Therefore, everyone had thought that Yi Shiwen would be defeated as soon as Emperor Qin would demonstrate his spatial ability. Yi Shiwen had also showed tyrannical strength, but nobody was optimistic about him when it came to fighting with Emperor Qin. However, everybody realized that Yi Shiwen was too tyrannical once the real fight started, and his speed was extremely high. This fact was even more important. He obviously didn't have the means to prevent Emperor Chen's spatial ability. However, he was fast enough to ensure that he could retaliate before he got hit by Emperor Chen's surprise attacks. Yi Shiwen might not be able to land a fatal blow on him. However, this passive fighting style would also be quite effective. It turned out that Emperor Qin had sustained injuries as a result of this attack. Everyone was dumbstruck. They didn't expect that Yi Shiwen would injure Emperor Qin even though he had revealed the spatial ability. This outcome is beyond everyone's imagination. Who would have guessed that this would come to happen? Someone exclaimed. Yeah, it's an extremely thrilling fight. It's changing its course every now and then. Everyone had thought that Emperor Qin would gain upper hand since the start. However, he fell into Yi Shiwen's trap and has been forced into a disadvantageous position. Yi Shiwen has played him quite miserably, someone acknowledged. Emperor Qin would have been thoroughly defeated by Yi Shiwen if he hadn't displayed his spatial ability at the last moment. After all, Yi Shiwen had displayed an extremely terrifying combat strength. Nobody had thought that Emperor Chen wouldn't be able to suppress Yi Shiwen even after he had displayed his spatial ability. Moreover, they had never anticipated that Yi Shiwen would still be the first one to land a blow and injure Emperor Chen again. This outcome had left everyone in shock. In fact, they simply couldn't accept it. This Yi Shiwen is far too powerful. Even a guy like Emperor Qin can't suppress him with a spatial ability, someone spoke up. Yi Shiwen is far too strong. Look at his wings. I don't know what kind of magical ability this is, but his wings are too terrifying and ridiculously fast. Isn't it some kind of an ancient magical ability? This Yi Shiwen is very lucky. Someone had guessed how many magical abilities Yi Shiwen must have obtained to turn so ridiculously strong. This person obviously became very envious. A person could be on their way to be ranked as a Heaven's Pride expert if they could obtain even one of the magical abilities that Yi Shiwen possessed. Not to mention that so many of these magical abilities had concentrated together in the hands of one person. So, it wasn't surprising that Yi Shiwen had become so strong. Yi Shiwen didn't relax after he injured Emperor Qin. He knew that Emperor Chen was hiding within the space and was waiting for his injuries to heal. However, knowing this was also useless. Everyone knew this, but this knowledge was still useless. It seemed as if Yi Shiwen would tear the space and burst into the subspace. However, that would result in his body getting torn into pieces by the chaos energy. Even the great sage experts wouldn't dare to do that because the chaos energy was too frightening. The rumors suggested that the chaos energy was the mother energy of everything. In other words, all things in the 10,000 worlds had evolved out from the chaos energy. An Almighty had created this universe in the chaos, and this universe had come to be known as 10,000 worlds. This explains how the chaos energy had become incredibly famous as the mother energy of everything, and how tyrannical this energy was in reality. A person could only walk inside it unhampered, but only if they possessed tyrannical strength. However, it would a dead end for a person of Yi Shiwen's strength if he were to dare to go in. In fact, he would die instantly, and his body would be reduced to dust. However, people who possessed spatial ability could freely travel back and forth in the chaos. Of course, this was because they had an innate affinity for space. So the power of space would protect them from getting eroded by the chaos. Some special physiques could also move in the chaos freely. However, the people with such special physiques were very rare and had natural affinity for chaos energy since birth. They could even command the chaos energy to attack when they faced a powerful opponent. And the lower the opponent's cultivation, the scarier it would get for them. That's because the people with lower cultivation held lesser resistance towards chaos energy. So, this scenario was very dreadful for them. Yi Shiwen knew how dreadful the chaos energy was. So, he didn't dare to approach it, even though he possessed the gilded tyrant form. To be continued. Chapter 462. He wasn't afraid of being infected by small amounts of chaos energy. However, he would die if he were to burst into the chaos. Therefore, he must be extremely cautious. Emperor Qin might appear at any time, and Emperor would have recovered to his peak condition by the time he would reappear. So he would give a fatal blow as soon as he would reappear. Therefore, this fight would drag on indefinitely if Yi Shiwen couldn't kill Emperor Qin sooner. This may turn into a long, protracted fight, one of the spectators observed. Yi Shiwen can't stay this vigilant for a long time. And Emperor Qin can't continue like this either. He can't remain hidden inside the chaos for very long. Emperor Qin could escape inside the subspace since he possessed the spatial ability. However, he couldn't do it for very long unless he was a devil god who had lived in the chaos during the chaos era. Those who had bathed in the sacred lake a few times could also achieve this feat, however. Only these aforementioned people could stay longer in the chaos than those with spatial ability. Whoosh! Emperor Qin reappeared on the right side of Yi Shiwen. He looked somewhat fierce. A murderous look flashed in his eyes. He brandished his lance, and it released endless divine beams. They beams swept across the sky. They then crashed down like a huge star. This spectacle looked extremely terrifying. Blood-red rays of light erupted from the body of the golden lion. The skin on his body had begun to crack slightly. In fact, veins had started to pop out of its flesh. Its face had turned extremely grim. It seemed as if it was enduring unbearable pain. Rumble! The lance issued boundless aura. It seemed as if a god had raised his lance. Emperor Chen's aura had restored to its peak state. Rumble! Yi Shiwen raised his long sword to welcome the incoming attack. The long sword collided with the lance and set off boundless energy storms. The white jade stage under their feet gradually began to disintegrate. An endless amount of debris was flung around as a result, and the surrounding air curved and distorted. Everyone became terrified when they saw the scene. The bodies of the disciples of younger generation had turned ice cold. These two individuals possessed very formidable strength. Who could contend against them in such a bloody battle of life and death? Both of them were extremely intrepid, and everyone was scared to see them. Everyone compared themselves with these two individuals, but they felt that their bodies had turned cold. In fact, it was a hair-raising feeling of terror. Yi Shiwen condensed a seal attack, and the inverting ocean seal poured down towards Emperor Chen to crush him. Yi Shiwen had used the same old, formidable attacks. Buried sword secrets, the inverting ocean seal. These were very frightening martial arts. Each of them could scare a person to death. And these attacks had unleashed an incredible power in the hands of Yi Shiwen at this time. Buried sword secrets could bury anything, the heaven included. So, what was a mere human being? It could bury the heaven, bury the earth, bury a person, and bury all mortal creatures once it had been practiced to the peak. One sword strike could eliminate all living things in its path. It looked like an ordinary sword attack that didn't carry an outstanding, imposing aura. However, it had broken Emperor Chen's defense with an irresistible force. The inverting ocean seal smashed down as well. It was a dreadful seal technique. The inverting ocean seal and Han seal were completely different. The Han seal contained brute force, so it would carry irresistible force while it would smash down on someone. However, the inverting ocean seal was different from the Han seal. It was gentle like seawater. It was kind and soft like the steady flow of water. However, it was also inwardly sinister and could bring about a destructive flood. So, it was a much more profound attack when compared to the Han seal. It coupled strength and gentleness. The dreadful great seal smashed down. It appeared as if a boundless ocean had been overturned. The steadiness of this attack was very scary. Emperor Chen raised his lance to resist. However, he felt an unimaginable force being transferred into his hand through his lance. His hand almost broke off. The muscles in his hand exploded and spattered along with his blood. Everyone got scared when they saw this. Emperor Qin had already tasted loss once, so he couldn't possibly repeat the same mistake again. He dodged sideways to avoid the attack. Then he transformed into a yellow light and disappeared inside the space. Yi Shiwen wasn't worried this time. He revealed faint a smile on his face, on the contrary. He had finally found his opponent's weakness. The golden lion had already overused its ability, so its body would collapse very soon as a result. Traveling back and forth in the restricted space of the metropolis Marshall Peak must have been a very strenuous task for the golden lion, despite the fact that it possessed the spatial ability. In fact, it must have pushed itself to perform these sneak attacks. It's not good. I'm afraid that Emperor Qin may not be able to last long at this rate. Yi Shiwen possesses a very sharp eyesight. Many sage-level core disciples were present among the spectators. Everyone knew what level of people they were. They could clearly see that Emperor Qin had been forced into a corner. In fact, he might not be able to use the spatial ability for long. In other words, he would be the one to collapse if he couldn't kill Yi Shiwen soon. And it would be of no use even if he were to escape into the space, because he would be torn apart by the chaos once the Golden Lion were to perish. He was running out of time as the matter stood. The Lord of the Muddy Sky Island had already become nervous atop the tall platform. He wasn't nervous at first since he was very confident about Emperor Qin. He believed that Emperor Qin would defeat Yi Shiwen. However, he realized that he was overconfident about Emperor Qin after having watched the fight. Yi Shiwen's tyranny had gone far beyond his imagination. It's impossible. Emperor Qin has condensed 999 Tao principles, and each of these principles is at least 10 times thicker than that of an ordinary person. He can be considered at the peak in the younger generation with such strength. One doesn't even need to include the spatial ability in this equation. Then, why does he seem so vulnerable in front Yi Shiwen? The Lord of the Muddy Sky Island exclaimed in disbelief. He had confidence on Emperor Qin at the start of the fight. However, that confidence hadn't sources from his spatial ability alone. Emperor Qin's spatial ability was his hidden trump card. He had never revealed this ability before. Therefore, even the Lord of this island didn't know about this. The reason behind such confidence was Emperor Qin's inherent tyrannical strength. He had condensed 999 Tao principles, and each of these principles was at least 10 times thicker than that of an ordinary person. Therefore, calling him invincible in the semi-sage realm wouldn't be an overstatement. This was the main reason behind the Lord's confidence. Even someone who had the same strength as Emperor Qin wouldn't be able to prevail over him. It'd be a tie at the most. However, Emperor Qin looked very vulnerable in front of Yi Shiwen. What was going on? What the hell is this? What's going on? Everyone was perplexed, especially the disciples of the Muddy Sky Island. They had seen Emperor Qin's might in the past. Moreover, Emperor Qin hadn't even revealed the spatial ability back then. However, he had defeated each of his opponents and had earned himself the title of the undisputed king of East Sea. He had achieved that by relying on his invincible strength alone, nothing else. That fight between him and Qin Wang had been very devastating. However, everyone believed that Emperor Qin would kill Qin Wang even if they would engage in a bitter struggle. Both of them had condensed 999 Tao principles. However, if Qin Wang was elite among elites, then Emperor Qin was the king of kings. However, Yi Shiwen hadn't used some shameful tricks. He had suppressed Emperor Qin's counterattack by depending on his own strength, and such strength was truly dreadful. Such intrepid strength didn't look like that of a semi-sage expert. In fact, it seemed as if Emperor Qin was fighting against a sage expert, since he didn't have enough power to fight back. Has Yi Shiwen reached the sage realm? A bold disciple speculated. That's impossible. Yi Shiwen doesn't possess the unique aura of a sage expert. He's still in the semi-sage realm. He hasn't entered the sage realm yet. A sage-level core disciple shook his head and replied, "The sage experts were very susceptible towards the unique aura of the sage realm. Therefore, a sage expert couldn't conceal his strength from another sage expert, even if he had suppressed his true power. It's like an adult can't become a child no matter how much they pretend to be one. An adult will always look like an adult, even if one would chop their legs and shorten their height to make it equivalent to that of a child." The semi-sage experts used preliminary principles. However, the principles of the semi-sage experts were disordered and unorganized. There was no connection between each principle. However, this wasn't the case with sage experts. The principles of the sage experts were scattered, but not unorganized. A mysterious and inexorable force kept the magical symbols of these principles bound together. And these principles would come into play together as soon as an attack was launched by a sage expert. It would carry endless might compared to a semi-sage expert's attack, since the principles would act one at a time in the case of the latter. And this difference was even greater than the one between cloud and mud. However, Yi Shiwen's principles didn't appear to be bounded together. They still looked somewhat unorganized and disordered. "So, how's this possible?" someone asked doubtfully. How could Yi Shiwen be so powerful? Yi Shiwen knew that Emperor Qin had escaped into the subspace. He also knew that he could slowly push Emperor Qin towards his death by passing time. However, he couldn't become careless with it, and he couldn't delay too much. Therefore, Yi Shiwen finally decided against concealing his true power. Thus, his principles began to soar into the sky one after another. Then, they began to twine around him. 900, 997, 998, 999, 1,000. What? How's this possible? Yi Shiwen's principles soared into the sky and began to revolve around him. Someone counted the number of principles on his body, but the count reached 1,000 Tao principles. That person thought that he must have made some mistake, so he counted again. However, he still found out the count to be at 1,000 Tao principles. The gasping sounds started to resound one after another. Everyone believed that 999 Tao principles was the absolute upper limit in the semi-sage realm for a human expert. However, Yi Shiwen had condensed 1,000 Tao principles. This had gone beyond everyone's imagination. How's this possible? Everyone was shocked. The Lord of the Muddy Sky Island stood up from his seat. Little to nothing could have moved him this much when one take his cultivation into consideration. However, he had been frightened to such an extent that he had jumped up from his seat. He actually has 1,000. The Lord of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall also saw this scene. A strong murderous intention flickered in his eyes, apart from the obviously shocked look. This is the so-called matter of something so abnormal can only be a demon's doing. But this evil genius isn't even one of my subordinates. So, I will have to find a way to eradicate him. An unfathomable killing intention flashed in the eyes of the Lord of the Fire Cloud Cave, the Lord of Muddy Sky Island, and the other experts of the various other big forces, even though these other forces hadn't participated in this competition. To be continued. Chapter 463. They found it inconceivable to know that Yi Shiwen had condensed 1,000 Tao principles. They believed that condensing 999 Tao principles was the limit. However, he had condensed 1,000 Tao principles. Such strength could scare a person to death. This had already exceeded their expectations. A champion would emerge in every 100 years. However, it was quite difficult for those people to pose a threat to a person of the Lord of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall's rank. None of the previous champions had made him feel a sense of crisis. After all, talent was one thing, and smoothly growing to such an altitude was another. However, his killing intention had risen very steeply after he had realized that Yi Shiwen had condensed 1,000 Tao principles. In fact, the murderous intention was clearly visible in his eyes. He had a premonition in his mind that a person like Yi Shiwen could pose enormous threat to the Xian Yuan Palace Hall in the future if they ignored him and allowed him to grow up. The Supreme Lord would have discovered his unconcealed killing intention on ordinary days. However, he was also in shock at this time. He obviously hadn't anticipated that Yi Shiwen had condensed 1,000 Tao principles. Only sage experts could accomplish this feat. In fact, 1,000 Tao principles was the beginning of the sage realm. Yi Shiwen had 1,000 Tao principles, but his 1,000 Tao principles and a sage expert's 1,000 Tao principles were two entirely different things. As sage experts, 1,000 Tao principles would be scattered, but not disorganized. Moreover, the overall might of these principles would be endless. Therefore, the same 1,000 Tao principles would be far more tyrannical than those of Yi Shiwen's. This was the precise reason that had made him realize that Yi Shiwen hadn't made the breakthrough into the sage realm yet. However, this fact was even more stunning. It wouldn't have been strange for him if Yi Shiwen had become a sage expert. Moreover, he was also very surprised by Yi Shiwen's growth speed. These juniors of the younger generation had merely begun their cultivation journey as far as he was concerned. So, it didn't matter if they were a bit quick or a bit slower. One would be able to catch up with the others as long as they could come across some fortuitous adventures. However, Yi Shiwen had accomplished this in the semi-sage realm itself. This showed that Yi Shiwen might have astonishing potential, a potential which he wasn't aware of. His vision gradually turned resolute as he thought of this. Yi Shiwen hadn't heard people's comments. However, he felt that many tyrannical gazes had been sweeping over his body since the moment he had released his 1,000 Tao principles. In fact, he felt as if these knife-like, sharp gazes would cut open wounds in his body. In fact, he believed that these gazes would have been enough to kill him if he weren't inside the true martial university. However, he had already thought about this at the time when he had decided to reveal his 1,000 Tao principles. He knew what he wanted. He wanted to settle Emperor Chen's matter, once and for all, and he didn't wish to delay any further. So, he must use his entire strength to kill Emperor Chen. A crazy idea had secretly popped up in his heart. He knew that many forces would wish to get rid of him soon after he would reveal his true strength. He didn't believe in the saying that a tall tree attracts the strong winds. However, that very same proverb also spoke that those very trees tend to grow even stronger and faster after they've survived through the rainstorm, and they become far superior to the plants which have grown in the safety of a greenhouse. He wanted to take advantage of these external strong winds in order to temper himself and become even more tyrannical. Let the storm be even more violent. He felt that the world before his eyes had suddenly become much clearer after he had released his full strength. Many principles had remained hidden thus far, but they had unfolded themselves before his eyes at this time. Yi Shiwen noticed that a golden ray of light was flickering in front of his eyes. It appeared like a golden strand of hair that was floating in the sky. It was even issuing slight fluctuations of spatial power. Could it be that the golden lion was setting the coordinates with the help of these golden hairs? Yi Shiwen's eyes lit up. Suddenly, everything became clear in front of his eyes. He had been thinking that one must possess spatial coordinates in order to travel back and forth in the space, since the chaos flowed in the subspace. One may take a small step into the subspace. However, they might arrive at an unknown place when they would reappear in the main space. It was also possible to get lost inside the flowing chaos as a result. A powerhouse wouldn't need this kind of a positioning system because they could see the main space from the subspace. However, it should have been impossible for this immature golden lion to achieve that in the restricted space of the metropolis Marshall Peak. Therefore, Yi Shiwen had been wondering about what the golden lion had been using for fixing the coordinates, and he realized what that thing was when he saw the golden hair. Whoosh! Emperor Chen suddenly reappeared, but Yi Shiwen was already prepared. In fact, he noticed that the hair of the golden lion issued a spatial array at the spot where Emperor Chen had appeared. I see. Yi Shiwen shouted loudly. He brandished his sword. The sword energy soared into the sky like a rainbow and instantly swept down like a giant golden dragon. Emperor Chen disappeared hastily as soon as he saw that Yi Shiwen had discovered him. This battle is already decided. It will be very difficult for Emperor Chen to make a comeback, even though he possesses the spatial ability. It's not that he's not enough strong. Rather, Yi Shiwen is extremely powerful. 1,000 Tao principles in semi-sage realm. I've never heard of this, someone said regretfully. Everyone in the surroundings looked at him. He turned out to be a disciple of the Muddy Sky Island. He had lost his confidence on Emperor Qin. His expression had made it evident that he had been stunned by Yi Shiwen. Yeah, Yi Shiwen has constantly maintained himself at his peak condition. His secret healing technique is also exceptional. He doesn't even need to keep himself at his peak state for a long time. He only needs to do it for a bit longer than Emperor Qin. Emperor Qin can't go on like this for long. He'll get exhausted soon. So he must attack with the entirety of his strength, and as early as possible. Otherwise, he may not need to attack Yishuan later since he'll die inside the space's chaos. Someone had clearly understood what this scene represented. Emperor Chen's strength is on the level of previous champions. He would have won if he hadn't encountered a freak like Yi Shiwen. All I can say that he's very unlucky. Yi Shiwen suddenly moved to the middle of the arena for some unknown reason. Then he brandished his long sword and unleashed the Buried Heavens sword attack. A seemingly endless sword light burst out as a result. The attack spread in midair and went straight towards an empty spot. The spectators were baffled by this. After all, Yi Shiwen had acted like some crazy guy who had issued the sword attack towards an empty spot where no one was present. The space suddenly began to fluctuate violently after Yi Shiwen launched the attack. Then Emperor Chen's figure reappeared in front of the sword attack. Emperor Chen realized that a giant sword was already present in front of him as soon as he appeared. His complexion turned pale as a result. He didn't understand how his whereabouts had been ascertained. How was it possible? How had Yi Shiwen discovered his whereabouts? Pucci! Emperor Qin didn't get enough time to think. Yi Shiwen's long sword had already cut into his shoulder. Emperor Chen's body was extremely intrepid and could be compared with metals and stones. However, it was like butter in front of this dreadful sword intention and got cut as a result. Blood splashed out and showered down to the ground. Each drop of blood opened a small pit in the ground. This scene was exceptionally terrifying. Emperor Chen's entire arm had been chopped off. It had seemed that his entire body would be cut into two halves by Yi Shiwen's sword. However, he had snorted eerily and had maneuvered his body to shift sideways in order to avoid this fatal sword strike at that critical moment. However, his entire arm had still been cut off by Yi Shiwen. His blood was gushing out like a fountain. Emperor Chen's complexion had turned pale. He promptly urged his golden lion and disappeared into the space once again. This entire scene had taken place in a split second. No one had anticipated that they would see such a scene. An arm of the incomparably tyrannical Emperor Qin had been chopped off by Yi Shiwen's sword. Moreover, this hadn't even been the most surprising spectacle for most people. They were mostly surprised by the fact that Yi Shiwen had ascertained Emperor Chen's whereabouts in advance. One must know that Emperor Chen's spatial ability hadn't been able to take advantage of Yi Shiwen so far because Yi Shiwen's reaction speed was fast enough. In fact, Yi Shiwen's attacks would always impact first even though he would attack second. However, it was different this time. Everyone had seen that Yi Shiwen had attacked first. Yi Shiwen had brandished his sword first. Then Emperor Qin had appeared right at that spot. In fact, it had seemed as if both of them were coordinating with each other. It was as if Emperor Qin had presented himself before Yi Shiwen's sword so that Yi Shiwen could kill him. It seemed as if both of them had sparred together many a times. Yi Shiwen had brandished his sword, and Emperor Qin had voluntarily appeared before it to get chopped off. Everyone obviously wouldn't think that they were coordinating with each other. So there was only one possibility, and that was that Yi Shiwen had seen through Emperor Chen's whereabouts. In fact, he might have predicted it in advance. This was extremely dreadful. The spatial ability was the most dreadful ability because one could appear and disappear in an unpredictable fashion with the help of this ability. A person with spatial ability could easily hide inside the subspace and could then look for the most appropriate opportunity to attack. However, Emperor Qin suddenly appeared defenseless in front of Yi Shiwen, since he had unexpectedly lost the advantage of this ability. There wasn't any suspense left in this battle. Yi Shiwen suddenly found a tiny golden hair floating away at an astonishing speed at this time. So he realized that Emperor Qin must be trying to escape. Emperor Qin had repeatedly faced defeats against Yi Shiwen. However, he was still very strong. So it would become very troublesome for Yi Shiwen if he managed to escape. Yi Shiwen decided against waiting any further. He shouted loudly. The heavenly source mirror within his body suddenly released an astonishing blood column. The scarlet energy began to boil and flooded within Yi Shiwen's body. Then the heavenly source mirror integrated into his body, and he felt that his entire body had started to brim with power. Hidden dragon rises from the abyss. Yi Shiwen shouted loudly. A tinge of scarlet appeared on his golden hands. His hands suddenly transformed into a pair of dragon's claws, and he ripped open a huge crack in the space with these claws. The one-armed Emperor Qin appeared in front of Yi Shiwen as a result. He was about to escape when he discovered that Yi Shiwen had suddenly appeared in front of him. Puchi! The sword energy condensed into a huge sword. It started from the top of Emperor Qin's head and ran through his body as it pierced downward. Emperor Qin and his mount had been crucified in the chaos. To be continued. Chapter 464. Everyone held their breaths. There was pin-drop silence. Only a light breeze was blowing, but it carried the smell of blood with it. Some people felt somewhat nauseated because of it. Emperor Qin is dead. How can he die in this way? He died just like that. Someone spoke up as he watched the scene in disbelief. After all, Emperor Qin was extremely powerful in their opinion, and yet he had been impaled alive by Yi Shiwen in front of their eyes. Everyone had mentally prepared themselves for this outcome. After all, Emperor Qin had been firmly suppressed by Yi Shiwen from the get-go. However, watching Yi Shiwen killing Emperor Qin for real was a bit difficult for them to gulp. They had long thought that Emperor Qin would win this competition. Yi Shiwen had merely been one of the 8 powerful heavens' pride experts in their eyes, and Yi Shiwen's status as one of the 8 powerful heavens' pride expert didn't bother them at all. However, it was impossible for them to think that he would win the championship. However, Yi Shiwen had swept away his opponents and had reached the top like a dark horse. Even the most tyrannical opponent wasn't able to withstand even one blow from him, and Emperor Qin was no exception to this. He had been thoroughly suppressed by Yi Shiwen in large parts of the fight. Even his spatial ability couldn't make any difference. He had radically seemed to be worthless in front of Yi Shiwen. The slim figure of Yi Shiwen was standing in the arena. His facial expression looked as fresh as the clouds and as reckless as the wind. It seemed as if he had killed an insignificant man. Some people were terrified to see Yi Shiwen's might. Perhaps he was nothing at present. However, he might become an extremely dreadful person in the future after a few centuries once he would grow up. He had condensed 1,000 Tao principles in the semi-sage realm. In fact, nobody could tell what his accomplishments in the future would be once they'd take his talent was taken into consideration. A person like Yi Shiwen wasn't terrifying at the present. However, his tyranny would be most dreadful in the future. Countless gazes swept over Yi Shiwen's body, and there was no lack of genuine murderous auras amongst those gazes. It could be said that most people of forces other than true martial universities wanted to get rid of him. Yi Shiwen softly let out a sigh of relief. He felt very relaxed at this time. It seemed as if his inner realm had suddenly broken free of all the shackles. His cultivation level hadn't advanced, but his strength had already reached the pinnacle of the semi-sage realm. His strength should be able to make a breakthrough to the initial stage of the sage realm, as long as he would go through closed-door training one more time. His strength would then become comparable to the strength of the sage experts. Yi Shiwen would then be worthy of his current status of a core disciple. The core disciples were generally sage experts, unless in special circumstances. Yi Shiwen had defeated Emperor Qin, and the situation made it seem as if he had completely suppressed Emperor Qin before he had defeated the man in a thorough manner. However, only he knew how much preparation he had to do in order to defeat Emperor Qin. He had only considered Emperor Qin to be his most dreadful opponent since the beginning. He had also considered various battle scenarios. However, Emperor Qin had never cared enough about him to bother with such things. Therefore, one could say that Emperor Qin's defeat at Yi Shiwen's hand was to be expected from this angle. And it wasn't an exaggeration as guessed by the other people. Yi Shiwen was still quite afraid of Emperor Qin, even though he had already killed him. Emperor Qin wasn't strong. He was insanely strong. This championship would have fallen into his hands if I weren't here. He would have still been at the invincible position even if he had bumped into some other expert who had condensed 1,000 Tao principles, especially if one takes his spatial ability into consideration. In fact, he might even have defeated that opponent. Moreover, he would have become more dreadful once this spatial ability had matured further. He would have become extremely ferocious in the future. Even his golden lion would have matured in a similar fashion. He might even have condensed 1,000 Tao principles later on. Anyway, Yi Shiwen had killed Emperor Qin. Therefore, he had removed the worry from his heart, and he could relax for the time being. He had also obtained enormous benefits after going through the tough battle. Now he must look for an opportunity to undergo closed-door training in order to make a breakthrough. More so because he would have to face a myriad of schemes and plots in the future. He would certainly have the power to defend himself once his fighting strength would make a breakthrough to the sage realm. So, this was very important for him. The atmosphere had suddenly turned lively after a moment of strange silence. Everyone was discussing the sensational matter of Emperor Qin's death at Yi Shiwen's hands. Even the people who had confidence in Yi Shiwen before the contest had started hadn't thought that he could reach the top and become the champion. Most people would have considered him outstanding if he had managed to withdraw from the battle with his body intact. They placed themselves in the shoes of Yi Shiwen and thought that they would have thanked their ancestors if they had managed to get out with their body intact. However, the eyes of the Lord of Muddy Sky Island had turned ice-cold atop the tall platform. His complexion had turned ashen since he was watching Yi Shiwen stand in the square. However, he couldn't say anything. He had been very calm and collected earlier. He hadn't been worried because he had too much confidence in Emperor Qin. Emperor Qin was invincible among the contestants of the four forces in his opinion. Yi Shiwen was nothing. He hadn't even heard of Yi Shiwen before. He had thought that Yi Shiwen could only cause a bit of trouble for Emperor Qin even if he were to be extremely good. However, Yi Shiwen had given a tight slap on his face through his powerful performance. Yi Shiwen had made him realize that the Emperor Qin he had placed high hopes in wasn't as powerful as he had taken him to be. Therefore, he had been forced to accept that Emperor Qin's miserable end after he had watched Yi Shiwen's peak strength. Most importantly, he couldn't say anything about this fight. He couldn't find a reason to intervene. After all, Emperor Qin had gone out to look for trouble on his own accord. He himself had been in the wrong. It was already enough that the Supreme Lord hadn't caused trouble for Emperor Qin when he had broken the rule. Moreover, Yi Shiwen had defeated him by relying entirely on his own strength. He was burning with rage because of this feeling. However, he couldn't find any reason to vent his anger. He could only hold back forcibly. He had firmly grabbed the armrest of the throne with his both hands. The armrest was made up of jade. However, it crumbled like rotten dregs in his grip. Meanwhile, the complexion of the lord of the Xianyuan Palace Hall had also turned ugly. He had spoken many sarcastic words before the beginning of this contest. In fact, he had openly mocked Yi Shiwen. The Supreme Lord hadn't mentioned a word of it at this time. However, he could still imagine what must be going on in the Supreme Lord's mind regarding his contemptuous and taunting comments. It seemed as if he had voluntarily flung several tight slaps on his face by opposing the true Martial University. In fact, he was so depressed that he wanted to die. Therefore, the killing intention had become stronger in his eyes as he looked at Yi Shiwen. A mysterious light was flashing in the eyes of the Lord of the Fire Cloud Cave. Nobody could tell what he was thinking. He would always look like an illiterate. However, nobody dared to regard him as one. And those who'd regarded him as one would only end up vomiting blood when they'd find out that he was only pretending to be illiterate. Yi Shiwen is the winner of the finals, and the champion, the refereeing elder, declared the result. Everyone came to their senses and realized that this competition had finally ended. This term's competition had been brutal. It had left everyone in shock. Only 3 out of the 8 Big Heavens Pride experts had survived it. One was Hang Bing Wang, apart from Yi Shiwen, but he was still recuperating from his wounds. The other was Jin Wushang, but he had admitted defeat without a fight. However, the casualty rate had been more than 50% even then. It could be said that this competition had been nothing less than tragic, but not the most tragic one. However, it had undoubtedly been the most splendid one. Particularly, Yi Shiwen had managed to defeat Emperor Qin even though the latter had revealed the spatial ability. Countless people had regretted the fact that any of these 2 individuals were capable enough to win the championship if they had appeared in the former competition. However, they had appeared in this competition, so one of them had to die. It was like the saying, a mountain can't accommodate 2 tigers. Therefore, a showdown was necessary to decide the victor. Everyone was still immersed in that battle, even though the referee had declared Yi Shiwen as the winner. They hadn't come out of it yet. This term was coming to an end. The space suddenly fluctuated in a violent manner, right when the atmosphere was about to turn lively. It seemed as if a picture scroll had been torn, as a huge black crack was torn open in the sky in the fortified space of the metropolis Martial Peak. Then, 2 women rapidly flew out of it. The one in the front looked like a young woman. She seemed approximately 25 or 26 years old. She looked stunning. She looked quick-witted and had nice facial features. She looked very elegant. She was clad in a fire-colored long dress. It undoubtedly outlined her splendid figure. Her long hair was gently tied at the back of her body. Her thin lips looked smooth. She had a majestic presence. She was followed by a young girl. This young girl looked approximately 17 or 18 years old. Her big dark eyes glittered. She had thin lips, and her skin was fairer than snow. She looked beautiful. She was clad in a green and long robe and seemed elegant and refined. However, there was a look of anxiety and disbelief on her face. "Who are you people? How dare you trespass into the true Martial University?" The Supreme Lord's dignified voice thundered ferociously. "Who are these people? They have actually dared to intrude into the true Martial University. They are so bold. You don't know. They aren't the people of your true Martial University. No, I've never seen them. And didn't you hear what the Supreme Lord spoke just now? They obviously don't belong to our true Martial University. So beautiful. I would even be willing to die if I can get close to them in this lifetime." The sudden arrival of these 2 women had shifted the attentions of everyone from Emperor Chen's death. However, they had also made the Supreme Lord extremely furious. This was the true Martial University, not some ordinary region. Moreover, it was the metropolis Martial Peak, a very important place in the true Martial University. It was a place of pilgrimage, not only for the people of true Martial University, but also for the people of the entire southern region. In fact, many Sage Realm and Great Sage Realm experts were personally keeping watch over this area because of this competition. The saying experts, such as clouds, wasn't enough to describe the number of experts who had been stationed on the metropolis Martial Peak at present. However, these 2 women had barged in a very casual manner. These 2 women had either had their heads kicked by a donkey and had probably turned into idiots because of that, or were they truly skillful and bold people? And everyone had to bet on the second possibility after they saw the calm and collected appearance of that woman in red. She seemed like a skilled powerhouse, someone who was daring enough to regard the true Martial University as nothing. Brother Taiha! That young girl in green ignored those countless gazes and went flying towards Yishiwen, while everyone was still trying to guess what she was up to. So they were very surprised to see that she had thrown herself upon the golden lion's body. Then she began to cry. She looked extremely sad. Her beautiful face had gotten stained with tears. Excuse us. We don't wish to oppose the true Martial University. We only wish to take our deceased back. The woman in red solemnly explained. It's you. You killed Brother Taiha. I must kill you and take revenge for him. That young girl in green clothes suddenly raised her head and spoke out in anger. The murderous intent flashed across her face as she looked at Yishiwen. To be continued. Chapter 465, published at 28th of November, 2017, 8:25 and 49 seconds p.m. Chapter 465, if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. The murderous intent had flooded the eyes of that young girl. Suddenly, a terrifying aura also erupted from her body. It blotted out the sky and covered the earth as it swept down towards Yishiwen to crush him like a mighty wave. A startled look flashed in Yi Zaiwen's eyes. The golden divinities immediately crawled over his body. He appeared like a god clad in golden clothes. This was his Bodis instinctive response. He hadn't activated his gilded tyrant form. This girl had forced Yi Zaiwen's body to activate the gilded tyrant form by using her imposing aura. Her strength was also a bit more tyrannical than that of Emperor Qin in Yi Zaiwen's opinion. Yishiwen had become even more wary after he had heard the girl address the Golden Lion as brother, because he knew that the Golden Lion belonged to the Demon Island. And the girl and the Golden Lion clearly knew each other. Therefore, even she might belong to the Demon Island. He was mostly afraid because of this reason. One must know that the Demon Island was a very mysterious place. Yishiwen was still very terrified of the Demon Island. He wasn't even a truth expert at that time he had visited that island for the first time. He didn't know anything about this place at that time. He had merely touched the tip of the iceberg. There were many things that he was unaware of. There were many weird places which could leave a person baffled. He had asked the wolf cub at that time. However, the wolf cub hadn't said anything. This had made the Demon Island even more secretive a place in his eyes. And this girl's strength had amazed him even more. She was already at the peak of the semi-sage realm. Her imposing aura was no less than his, and he had become even more vigilant because of this. So he was cautious to protect himself from this girl's sudden attack. Bai Lian, stop! The murderous intent was flashing across the girl's face. It seemed as if she was about to attack. However, she was stopped by the woman in red. Have you forgotten how I had repeatedly warned you before we came here? But this bastard killed Brother Taiha. That girl in green was emotional at the moment. Her face appeared a bit grim because of the distorted expression on it. Huang Taiha had chosen this path. This is his destiny. The woman insipidly said he had chosen to temper himself under the shadow of a human. He must have been prepared for this day as well. You're not a kid. You should understand that every person is responsible for their own decisions. I don't care. He has killed Brother Taiha, so he must die as well. The girl in green shouted loudly. Shut up, or I will personally take you back. The woman coldly shouted back at the girl. The green-clothed girl had no choice but to shut up resentfully when she saw that the woman in red had gotten angry. However, she was still glaring at Yishiwen, and her eyes were brimming with hatred. Yishiwen could feel that these two women weren't humans. They had concealed their identities very well, but he was exceptionally sensitive to any unusual aura because he had perfected the restraining breath technique. Moreover, it was evident that this green-clothed girl and the golden lion must be closely related to each other, and Yi Shiwen had understood this after he had seen her must-kill-him appearance. Even the wolf cub might belong to the same place, and probably had the same origin. Yi Shiwen had seen all kinds of mysterious aspects of the wolf cub. Therefore, he didn't dare to look down on these women. Everyone was stupefied as they heard the dialogues of these two women. One of them wanted to kill Yi Shiwen, but the other one didn't. What was going on here? Why hadn't they reached an agreement before they had come here? Young lady, I am not aware why you've come here. The Supreme Lord broke the silence and spoke. His voice penetrated the clouds and mists above the tall platform and reached everyone's ears. People obviously weren't expecting the intruders to be attacked in a direct manner. They were expecting that the intruders would be captured and interrogated after that. Even the Supreme Lord felt that the aura of the woman in red was very terrifying. However, he couldn't feel any hostility from her. So, there was no need to fight with them to the death. She possibly had the support of some big force. And he also felt that the Lord of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall and the other lords were taking pleasure in someone else's misfortune. They were hoping for him to die in a battle with this woman, since they would obtain great benefits for being the third party in this dispute. However, the Supreme Lord wouldn't let them obtain any benefits whatsoever. Please don't take us in a wrong way. We don't have any grudges against your university. We also don't have any evil intentions. We only wish to take away our clan's member. The woman in red explained to clarify the doubts. She possessed tyrannical strength, but it would be akin to courting death if she would try to cause trouble for the true Martial University, especially on the metropolis Martial Peak, where there were as many experts as clouds. Many great sage experts were keeping watch on this place. Who would dare to be presumptuous here? The woman in red had pointed towards the golden lion's corpse, a corpse that had already turned cold. "You're not from the human race?" The lord of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall opened his mouth and asked. The entire place immediately turned silent. This world was very big. The human race wasn't all that existed in this world. However, the world was big if one would call it big, and it was also small if one would call it so. The natural resources were limited, so a race must fight with other races if they wanted to grow. For example, the devil race had invaded the true martial world several times. It could be said that they had barged inside in order to fight for the resources. Two different races very rarely had good relations. In fact, many races were mortal enemies. Therefore, this remark of the lord of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall had turned the entire place silence. In fact, there was a pin-drop silence on the peak. Everyone had held their breath. Everyone looked towards the Supreme Lord. They all wanted to hear what he had to say. He shot a glance at the lord of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall. Wouldn't he have understood why the other person had spoken such words? He obviously wanted to arouse a conflict between this woman and the true Martial University. In fact, it would be best if he could extend full support to this woman against the true Martial University. In that case, the other forces would be able to obtain great benefits, since they'd be the third party in this dispute. The lord of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall was a very conniving person. "We won't stop you, since you wish to take away your clan's member," the Supreme Lord replied indifferently. He had nothing to do with the relation between the Golden Lion and the Muddy Sky Island. So, he was merely doing her a favor at little to no cost. In fact, it would be good for the true Martial University if a conflict were to break out between the Muddy Sky Island and the big force that supported this woman. The face of the Lord of Muddy Sky Island had turned a bit ugly. He wanted to take the corpse of the Golden Lion away. After all, it was a strange beast which possessed spatial ability. It was rare, so he could have obtained an enormous benefit if he could research its spatial ability. However, he had no choice but to nod in a bitter manner. This was the true Martial University's region, So he wouldn't be able to keep the corpse of the Golden Lion if he didn't get the true Marshall University support. Thanks a lot. The woman cupped her hands in obeisance and replied. The Lord of the Muddy Sky Island got depressed. In fact, he felt like vomiting blood. You are making a big mistake. You should be thanking me for giving up the lion's corpse. This Supreme Lord of the true Marshall University has seized my opportunity of doing a favor. However, could he say this? Obviously not. It wasn't good to offend a stranger to obtain the corpse of the Golden Lion. There might be a very tyrannical force behind her. So he might have to suffer a great loss for being greedy over a small profit. The green-clothed girl turned around as she held the corpse of the Golden Lion in her hands, and she looked at Yi Shiwen in a very fierce manner. Her expression had turned very sinister. The woman in red trod in the void and came down from midair. She arrived in front of Yi Shiwen and said, "You're quite good." Yi Shiwen became a bit confused when he heard this. He knew that he had provoked that young girl in green. In fact, he would do the same again if given a chance. After all, he would have died if he hadn't killed them instead. So there was no chance of holding back in that situation. The woman revealed a smile when she saw him looking confused. She spoke, "Someone has asked me to tell you that he would come looking for you after would come out of the closed-door training. And he will teach you a good lesson." How could Yi Shiwen not have understood this? It had to be the wolf cub. So, this woman must also be from the Demon Island. No wonder she possessed such incredible strength. Even a person like the Supreme Lord hadn't dared to act blindly when it had come to dealing with her. The wolf cub had been tidied up terribly by Yi Shiwen when they had met for the first time, and he had been clamoring that he would take revenge ever since. He would also tidy up Yi Shiwen very miserably sooner or later. In fact, he had often looked for an opportunity to fight with Yi Shiwen every time after he had made a breakthrough. However, unfortunately, it was always Yi Shiwen who'd teach him a lesson every time. "Is he doing fine?" Yi Shiwen asked. "He's undergoing a closed-door training," the woman in red replied. Yi Shiwen felt relieved after he came to know that the wolf cub was doing fine. The woman disappeared into the void after she was done speaking. That girl in green shot a hateful glance at Yi Shiwen and disappeared into the void. Everyone suddenly came back to their senses as soon as those two women departed. These two women were extremely audacious. Does your true Marshall University have a paper barrier that allows anyone to come in and go out as they wish? A disciple of the Xian Yuan Palace Hall spoke with a schadenfreude expression. This matter had obviously struck the true Marshall University's prestige a bit. The opposite party obviously hadn't harbored evil intentions. However, this incident had still given a blow to the true Marshall University's prestige. Humph! They weren't humans. They must be from the demon race or some other alien race. I think demon race. Didn't you hear what she said? She had arrived to take away her clan's member. That golden lion belongs to the demon race of the Demon Island. Therefore, these two women clearly belong to the demon race as well. This martial arts competition between the four forces had finally come to an end, and had ended perfectly. This martial arts competition had revealed one climax after another. The Xian Yuan twin Stars brothers had been everyone's favorites to win this competition because of their outstanding reputation at the start. Then Emperor Qin had revealed his spatial ability and had replaced them as the favorites. However, Yi Shiwen turned out to be the finest dark horse. Another disciple of the true Marshall University had also entered the semi-finals. However, everyone felt that he was merely lucky. Otherwise, it would have been impossible for him to enter the semi-finals, since his strength was equal to that of a quasi-heavens pride expert. Luck was also a part of strength. However, he still couldn't obtain everyone's acknowledgement. Only Yi Shiwen could be considered as the perfect dark horse. Initially, he was merely ranked among the 8 big heavens pride experts, and nobody had been optimistic about him. However, he had revealed astonishing strength once the competition had begun. People had been very optimistic about characters like Chi Tian, Twin Stars brothers, and Emperor Qin. However, all of them had been killed by Yi Shiwen. He had turned out to be the ultimate winner. To be continued. Chapter 466. The martial arts competition between the four forces had come to an end. Yi Shiwen had won this term's championship amidst the cheers of everyone. The outcome of almost all the previous competitions had been controversial. However, one could hardly raise any question on the outcome of this term's competition. The Xian Yuan Palace Hall and the other forces were certainly depressed. However, they didn't show any objection on the outcome. They had seen the entire competition with their own eyes. They had seen that Yi Shiwen had effortlessly defeated his enemies by relying on his tyrannical strength. Moreover, they had witnessed his transformed appearance in his final battle with Emperor Qin. It's not that the other people were too weak. Rather, Yi Shiwen was far too strong. Wouldn't those who had lost at Yi Shiwen's hands have lost their faces even further if they had raised questions on him? Therefore, hardly anyone raised any question once the martial arts competition came to an end. Several people gasped in surprise, though. However, the competition had ended anyway. They could no longer change the result. In fact, the people of the major forces had already started to pack their bags in order to return to their respective homes. 3 major forces had suffered disastrous losses in this time's competition. The Fire Cloud Cave's only Heaven's Pride expert, Chi Tian, had been killed by Yi Shiwen. The Xian Yuan Palace Hall had high hopes for Twin Star's brother. However, they couldn't even display their true strength in the fight and had ultimately been defeated by Yi Shiwen. They weren't able to collaborate and attack together. Many people had found that to be a very pitiful fact. The Muddy Sky Island's condition was better among those 3 forces. After all, Sea Demon Jin Wuxian was still alive. He had surrendered in front of Emperor Qin since they were acquaintances. Therefore, he hadn't died. The true martial university was this time's victor. But even their condition wasn't good. They had lost Qin Wang, and Han Bing Wang had been injured seriously and hadn't been able to recover as yet. Yi Shiwen had won the championship, but that was only a modest compensation at most. This had been a brutal competition. All the participants were outstanding experts. In fact, many people went as far as to say that no matter how powerful these Heaven's Pride experts were, they all were merely meant to pave the way for the champion in the end. The road to invincibility is paved with endless skeletons, and these people might also end up becoming the bones to pave others' road to invincibility. Everyone trembled in fear as they thought of this possibility. Therefore, the number of participants wasn't too big in comparison to the enormous population of disciple community. Even the lucrative rewards hadn't helped this fact. However, this competition had already ended, and it had left behind countless memories. In fact, it had also left behind an invincible legend. Yi Shiwen's tyrannical figure had entered into their eyes for the first time, but it had engraved itself into their souls. They might never forget that a man named Yi Shiwen had suppressed many outstanding experts fair and square to win the championship. Yi Shiwen's name had spread throughout the world after this competition. In fact, he had also become famous in the distant central region through the word of mouth. People had started to praise Yi Shiwen as an outstanding young expert from the southern region. He was undoubtedly on the verge of giving shock to countless young experts, and there were many who now considered him an eyesore, and such people desperately wanted to get rid of him as quickly as possible. However, becoming invincible in the future wasn't Yi Shiwen's goal. He had wanted to temper himself through this competition. This was the reason for which he had returned to participate in this martial arts competition, and this had been his greatest harvest as well. There were other rewards as well, and his wealth had increased considerably after this competition. His stock of primary spirit dawn had surpassed 20 million. Apart from the champion's reward he got by winning the competition, he also won 3 million primary spirit dawn for betting on his own victory. However, The biggest reward had come from the Jaedyong Peak, an amount of 10 million primary spirit dawn. He still remembered the astonished look in the eyes of the expert of the Jaedyong Peak who had arrived to give him the primary spirit dawn. They perhaps hadn't thought of a possibility wherein he'd become the champion in the end. The Jaedyong Peak had offered a reward of 10 million primary spirit dawn in a rage because Emperor Qin had killed Qin Huang. However, they hadn't believed that Yi Shiwen could kill Emperor Qin. Yi Shiwen had been famous from the start. He was considered very tyrannical in the younger generation. However, Emperor Qin was extremely powerful. After all, even Qin Huang hadn't lasted long in front of him and had been killed rather easily by Emperor Qin. So, how could Yi Shiwen possibly kill Emperor Qin? It could be said that they were overestimating Emperor Qin. It would be better to say that they hadn't expected that there could be such a big disparity between Yi Shiwen and Qin Huang. Qin Huang had lost in front of Emperor Qin very easily, but the latter didn't stand a chance against Yi Shiwen. This was like a mockery on Qin Huang's memory. However, Yi Shiwen didn't care about how astonished that expert of the Jaedyong Peak was. Obtaining this reward of 10 million primary spirit dawn was the most important thing for him. He wasn't even worried that the said person would refuse to give him the reward. After all, 10 million primary spirit dawn was an astronomical wealth for a semi-sage experts. In fact, it wasn't a small amount for the sage realm experts either. However, this amount wasn't enough to make such a countless years-old inheritance like Jaedyong Peak to break their promise to reward Yi Shiwen. After all, it was one among the top 10 inheritances. Now, Yi Shiwen didn't need to worry about the shortage of primary spirit dawn before he had made a breakthrough into the sage realm, since he possessed more than 20 million in his stock. The consumption rate of primary spirit dawn for his cultivation was much higher than that for an ordinary person. However, 20 million primary spirit dawn were still enough. Yi Shiwen was about to leave for the Hidden Star Peak from the metropolis Martial Peak, when he saw a young man rushing over from some distance. This man had a very fair skin tone. "Brother Yi, please wait." That young man saw Yi Shiwen and immediately asked him to stop. Yi Shiwen saw his clothes. He seemed like a disciple of the metropolis Martial Peak, but he had restrained his aura. Moreover, the principles in his body were condensed together, not scattered. This meant that this man was a sage expert. "May I know the senior brother's name?" Yi Shiwen cupped his hands in obeisance and asked. "My name is Zun Hushiu." The young man smiled and replied. A smile as bright as the sun appeared on his face. However, it wasn't as dazzling as Qi Fifen's smile. His smile looked a bit milder to that of Qi Fifen. "Nice to meet you, senior brother Zung. What's the reason behind your visit?" Yi Shiwen asked doubtfully. He had already received the champion's reward. So what else it could be? "Actually, the Supreme Lord has sent me to inform Junior Brother Yi that the Water Moon Cave will be open for you tomorrow. It is located inside the true martial secret territory. I hope that young Brother Yi makes preparations, since the allotted time is 3 years." Zhang Heshu replied as he looked at Yi Shiwen. An inexplicable look of envy could be seen flashing in his eyes. True martial secret territory. Yi Shiwen trembled as soon as he heard these 4 words. So, it's the true martial secret territory. True martial secret territory was extremely famous in the True Martial University. However, not everyone knew where it was located. On the contrary, only a very few people knew about what was inside the True Martial Secret Territory, even though it was extremely famous. And that's because the True Martial Secret Territory wasn't open to ordinary people. It was accessible only to a few core disciples, and that too only to a very few outstanding core disciples. Only the seed disciples that were at the peak of the sage realm got the opportunity to enter True Martial Secret Territory. A place like the True Martial Secret Territory had left behind endless legends for the experts below the rank of core disciples. And this was the True Martial University's core place as per the legends. There were obviously many rumors floating around in the true Martial University. One such rumor said that several old and monstrous experts had died in a seated posture or had vanished within true Martial secret territory, and they had become living fossils now. But these very people had once practiced with full devotion within the true Martial secret territory in the hope to make a breakthrough to the next realm. However, it was still a sacred place for many disciples of the true Martial University. It was said that the founder had once established the true Martial University's orthodox teaching in the true Martial secret territory. Only a handful of elite true disciples were allowed to enter the true Martial secret territory apart from those highest level elders. Nobody had ever heard that any disciple below the rank of core disciples had gotten the opportunity to enter this place. Yi Shiwen was barely hanging to the rank of core disciple since he was still at the semi-sage realm. So, he wasn't a full-fledged core disciple yet. Everyone who had gone there had advanced by leaps and bounds in the ensuing years, and had become the true Martial University's pillars and elites soon after they had come out of that place. And that was because only the outstanding core disciples who were at the sage, great, complete realm would get to go there on normal occasions. So they would come out as great sage exerts. Therefore, it could be said that this was also a shortcut that led to the great sage realm. Yi Shiwen had obviously yearned for the true Martial secret territory as well. However, he hadn't really thought about it before when it came to it. That's because his strength wasn't enough for it. The rank of a core disciple was certainly attached to his name. However, he was far from the standards of a core disciple. The sage realm was still far away, let alone the sage, great, complete realm. The gap between that and his current level was the same as the difference between cloud and mud or the heaven and earth. In fact, he might not be allowed to enter the true Martial secret territory even if he were to reach the sage, great, complete realm. Only those who had performed a great service to the true Martial University possessed enough accumulated points to enter this place. One would gain points every time one would complete a mission for the true Martial University, and only those who had enough points could enter this place. However, all those points would be exchanged for days they'd get to spend inside the place at the time of their entry. In fact, a year's time could make a sage expert go bankrupt, let alone 3 years. 3 years' time was quite short for an expert. More so because of the closed-door training sessions and so on. In fact, it would pass in a split second. However, it mattered a lot when it came to aspect of the location that one was undergoing closed-door training at. And one could obtain unimaginable benefits in 3 years of closed-door training inside the true Martial secret territory. Yes, young brother Yi, your performance was outstanding this time. It has greatly boosted the prestige of our true Martial University. Your outstanding performance has been taken into account, and you will gain access to the Water Moon Cave inside the true Martial secret territory for 3 years as your reward. Zhang Hexiu looked at Yi Shiwen and replied. An exceptionally envious look flashed in his eyes as he said this. Even he could only dream about a place like the true Martial secret territory, since he didn't have enough points to enter it. It wasn't that he didn't have enough points to enter it for even 1 day. However, spending 1 or 2 days in that place was insignificant. One must at least have enough points for more than 1 month's stay to see any significant results. To be continued. Chapter 467. Chapter 467. Northern Dipper Organization. Zhang Hexiu realized that Yi Shiwen had no knowledge on the subject as soon as he saw him. So he explained to Yi Shiwen. The true Martial secret territory was very huge, and it was divided into different regions. Each of these regions had different functions. The Water Moon Cave A.K., a Water Moon fairyland, wasn't a cave in reality. Rather, it was an entire region. The founder of the true Martial University had gained enlightenment inside the Water Moon Cave, and that cave was located in the Water Moon fairyland. Consequently, he had laid the foundation of the true Martial University. There were many leftover martial art heritages in this water-moon fairyland. Some people said that the ancestors of the true Marshall University had created these heritages and had then left them behind for the later generations. However, some people also said that these startling heritages had pre-existed the era of the ancestors, and the ancestors of the true Marshall University had merely obtained them. Every influential person in the university knew this fact that the human race of the true marital world had migrated from other regions. Therefore, this explanation was also quite popular. In other words, the Supreme Lord had allowed Yi Shiwen to choose one of the heritages for his cultivation. In fact, there were 49 types of heritages in the Water-Moon Fairyland. However, one could advance by leaps and bounds to become an extremely ferocious great sage expert as long as one could master any one of these heritages. Nobody had studied an entirety of these 49 heritages on a trot so far. Rumors say that nobody had achieved that feat apart from the founder of the true Marshall University. Each of these 49 stunning heritages possessed great might and was worth studying diligently for a lifetime. However, one wouldn't even be able to perfect a single technique if they tried to forcefully study all of these heritages at once, and their hard work would go in vain as a result. This was definitely a generous reward for Yi Shiwen, regardless of which angle one would consider this from. Therefore, it could be assumed that the upper echelon must have been very pleased with him this time. Yi Shiwen finally felt that the upper echelon was attaching great importance to him now. His level promotion had always fallen behind in comparison to the others. So, the top authorities had always been doubtful whether they should focus on nurturing him or not. Moreover, the people of the law enforcement hall had always been hostile towards Yi Shiwen and didn't want him to gain the attention of the top authorities. However, it didn't matter anymore. Nobody could neglect him anymore. After all, he had won the championship. This had made him excited. Hadn't he wished for this exact thing to happen? Yi Shiwen had suddenly become widely famous after he won the championship. Everyone in the younger generation had started to consider him as the strongest person. Some people hadn't been convinced of this earlier. However, everyone had started to accept the fact that he possessed tyrannical strength after this competition came to an end. Yi Shiwen returned to the Hidden Star Peak after he bid his farewell to Zhang Heshu. He didn't wish to become the center of attraction. He would have to wait for a while for everything to turn normal. But that wouldn't happen until everyone's attention had been diverted from the memory of this competition. Yi Shiwen returned to the Hidden Star Peak. However, he was surprised to see a young Taoist priest on the peak. And this priest was looking at Yi Shiwen with a smiling expression of his face. He was clad in a moon-white robe, and his robe was faintly glowing under the moonlight. He was floating in the air like an immortal. His silhouette looked pure and spotless. He looked like an ordinary person and seemed approximately 25 or 26 years old. However, he possessed a strangely clean and fresh aura which would make people curious. Qing Su. Yi Shiwen immediately recognized him and called out his name. He was very surprised to see this person. He had never thought that he would see Qing Su here. They hadn't seen each other since a decade. They had met last when they had left the Demon Island. Yi Shiwen had a profound impression of this Taoist priest. In fact, it was very similar to the one he had about Emperor Qin. Qing Su was the only real monk he had seen in both his lives. He hadn't seen any Taoist priest in the true martial world apart from him, and he had only seen the superficial ones in his previous life since most of them had been depraved over time. Therefore, he had always felt that the Taoist priests were rather poor before he had met Qing Su. However, there had been an enormous change in his point of view ever since he had met Qing Su. However, Yi Shiwen hadn't received any news of Emperor Qin and Qing Su after he had left the Demon Island. They had neither embarked on the ancient road, nor had they joined the true Martial University. Therefore, he was quite surprised to see Qing Su in the true Martial University. Yi Shiwen, congratulations for winning the championship. A gentle smile appeared on Qing Su's face, same as before. In fact, There wasn't any fake politeness in his demeanor, unlike the other monks. Yi Xuan replied as he looked at him, "We haven't met in a decade, and I'm not willing to believe that you've come here merely to congratulate me." He had spoken in a very blunt manner. However, he had good relations with Qing Su. The so-called friendship between gentlemen should be as insipid as water. That was probably the case here. "Let me explain this, Moon dear. I will come straight to the point, and without trying to cover things up like a woman." A hoarse voice suddenly sounded out of nowhere. Then a tall figure came out from the void. Yi Xuan saw this figure with the help of the moonlight's illumination, and he saw a young man who was approximately 20 years old. He was almost 2 meters tall, and was clad in a white robe which had blended into the dim moonlight. Therefore, it was quite difficult for a person to spot him. Yi Xuan frowned. He suddenly became vigilant in his heart. He hadn't discovered that someone was hidden in the void. It had happened because he had never been too vigilant on the hidden star peak. Moreover, this person's strength was very high. "What's this about?" Yi Xuan asked. "I'll tell you." That tall man looked at Yi Xuan and replied, "We wish to invite you to join our organization, the Northern Dipper." "The Northern Dipper?" Yi Xuan asked. He secretly became alert. What type of an organization was this? How come he had never heard about this organization? "Our organization specializes in recruiting young elites, and we only recruit the most outstanding young elites," that tall man answered. Yi Xuan had heard of many such organizations. In fact, the Army of God had been one such organization. Wasn't this the characteristic of most organizations? There were many organizations like this, only their strengths varied. Some targeted the elites of an entire region. Some targeted only a country, while some only a city. "Are you also a member of this organization?" Yi Xuan looked at Qing Su and asked. He wouldn't have paid attention to it if this were to be an ordinary organization. He himself could have established one such organization anytime and anywhere. However, he didn't have any interest in that. Even the formation of the Qianyu faction hadn't been his planning. He only believed in cultivating unfettered. However, it would be a different matter if Qing Su was also a member of this organization. Qing Su's strength had always been unfathomable. Yi Xuan couldn't see through his cultivation, and the tall man also possessed the same kind of unfathomable strength. This obviously indicated that the strength of this organization must be very impressive. "Yes." Qing Su nodded. He didn't deny. Yi Xuan also noticed that his white robe looked exactly the same as that of the other man's. "We had arrived to observe Emperor Qin. However, we found you more appropriate. So we've come to invite you," the man insipidly said. Yi Xuan immediately understood the matter. So this was the reason. They must have seen today's fight between him and Emperor Qin. They had wanted to invite Emperor Qin, but he died. So they came to invite him instead. The fact was that no one wants to favor the dead. The fame and glory that Emperor Qin had gathered throughout his life had disappeared along with his defeat in the last fight. This was blatant truth. In other words, who would have remembered Yi Xuan if he had been defeated in the last fight? "Sorry, but I have no interest in joining any organization since I don't like other people to have control over me." Yi Xuan shook his head and replied, "This organization's influence wasn't meager. Each of its members possessed great abilities. However, he was very afraid of joining one such organization, and he particularly didn't have any interest in being controlled by other people." "You don't have to decide in a hurry." Qing Su opened his mouth and spoke up at this time. "Our organization isn't strict, so it won't limit your freedom. They will at most inform you during the time of an assignment. However, they won't force you to complete the task. You will be free to choose whether you wish to complete a task or not." You can't imagine our organization's information network and the amount of resources we possess. Qing Su continued. You won't regret if you join our organization. Moreover, there are no mandatory requirements. Such benefits. Yi Shiwen narrowed his eyes. He wasn't convinced. How could an organization give such nice treatment to its members? However, he didn't suspect that Qing Su was fooling him. He knew that this priest wouldn't deceive him because there was no need for that. Yi Shiwen would quickly find out the truth once he had joined this organization. Anyway, he genuinely trusted Qing Su. Has incredible resources and information network. However, it isn't compulsory to complete a task. How has such an organization not gone out of business yet? Of course, not everyone can enjoy such treatment. The tall man explained. Only the official members of our organization get such treatment. People at the lower ranks need to complete corresponding tasks every month. Of course, you will also have to contribute corresponding points if you'd like to get additional resources apart from the basic ones. And you'd only get those points from missions. Yi Shiwen understood the matters as he heard this man's explanation. This organization wouldn't be far from collapsing if everyone enjoyed such treatment. Most importantly, it wasn't compulsory to complete a task. However, one must complete the tasks if they wanted additional benefits. They wouldn't get extra resources if they didn't contribute points. It obviously wouldn't have been a good deal if he were to join as low-level member. However, he would be at much ease if were to become an official member of this organization from the start itself. He would then be free to choose whether he wanted to undertake a task or not. In other words, this would become another source of information and resources for him. After all, the true Martial University regarded him as shady, since he had many secrets. His devil wings would be one such example. However, that wouldn't be an issue in the case of this organization. To be continued. Chapter 468. Chapter 468 enters the true martial secret territory. It seemed as if there wasn't any harm in joining this organization. There wasn't any pressure of completing the task. Moreover, he also had the option of completing the tasks and accumulating the points whenever he required extra resources. In short, there was freedom. However, Yi Shiwen also understood that the opposite party would give exciting offers to incite him into completing the missions if they were daring to pledge such a condition. However, this wasn't a bad thing either. Giving an alternative option wasn't a bad thing. Moreover, your sworn enemy, the first god, has joined another organization, and that organization is named the Southern Dipper. He may cause you some trouble in the future. Qing Su faintly added. Yi Shiwen's pupils suddenly contracted. He had always been very concerned about the first god's whereabouts. He hadn't cared about the army of God at first. However, he had understood that there was someone very powerful in the army of God when the second god had made an appearance. The second god had also caused a considerable amount of trouble to him. This obviously indicated that the first god must be more powerful since he was above the second god in ranking. However, Yi Shiwen had never heard any news of him, but he hadn't thought that he would get this news from Qing Su. What kind of an organization was the Southern Dipper organization? It must be an extraordinary organization if Qing Su had mentioned it in such a serious manner. People of the rank of Qing Su had joined the Northern Dipper organization. So, this organization was undoubtedly an extremely terrifying one. Northern Dipper and Southern Dipper. Why do they sound so similar? Yi Shiwen was silent for a while. Then he suddenly grinned and asked, Yes, there is some connection. However, there's no need for you to know these things at this time. You will slowly get to know these things if you join our organization. I'm asking you again, will you join? The tall man replied impatiently. It was evident that he didn't wish to give more explanations to Yi Shiwen. Wood Dragon, don't get too impatient. He will probably become your partner in the future. Qing Su laughed and spoke. He seemed quite familiar with Wood Dragon's nature. Wood Dragon didn't say anything. He was just firmly stared at Yi Shiwen in order to see his reaction. Yi Shiwen frowned. He was silent and didn't say anything. He wasn't worried about his own safety. He had apparently heard some secrets. However, it shouldn't matter much. These things seemed secretive at first, but such matters didn't have any secrets to them in reality. He didn't know anything apart from the name of this organization, Northern Dipper. Not to mention that this was the hidden star peak of the true Marshall University. So these two men had better not provoke any old monster in this vicinity. Otherwise, they wouldn't even be able to run away from here. Yi Shiwen raised his head after he had considered the pros and cons. Then he smiled and spoke. "I'll join if that's the scene." There were indeed many benefits in joining this organization, and Yi Shiwen didn't see any harm either for the time being. He would anyway leave this organization if things didn't go well. "Good, I'm glad." Wood Dragon laughed and said, Yi Shiwen got to know a bit about the situation within the Northern Dipper organization once he had agreed to join it. This was an organization that specialized in recruiting only top elites of the younger generation. It didn't have many full-time members if the bottom-level members weren't taken into count. There were only 14 real members apart from the organization's lord. The lord was titled Big Dipper. The 7 constellations of the Azure Dragon of the East constituted 7 seats, and the remaining 7 seats belonged to the 7 constellations of the Vermilion Bird of the South. These were their 14 members, and they still had vacancies. There weren't even 20 members in this organization at the moment. Yi Shiwen joined and became the Golden Dragon of the Neck, which was one of the 7 constellations of the Azure Dragon of the East. This position had been kept for Emperor Qin in the beginning. However, it had now fallen into Yi Shiwen's hands. Qing Su was Moon Deer of the Extended Net. That was one of the 7 constellations of Vermilion Bird of the South. And that tall man who was Yi Shiwen's possible future partner was Wood Dragon of the Horn. This title was also named after one of the 7 constellations of the Azure Dragon of the East, same as Yi Shiwen's title. I will inform you if there will be any task or matter in the future. You can choose to do the task or not. They gave Yi Shiwen a dragon ring and a set of white uniforms once they were done talking, and then they floated away and departed. Yi Shiwen was a bit dumbfounded as he saw them float away like a feather. They had said that this organization wasn't strict. However, that didn't mean that it was extremely liberal either. However, Yi Shiwen merely smiled. After all, the organization wouldn't put any restriction on his freedom. He could go anywhere he would like to whenever he wouldn't be on an assignment, and it would depend on him whether he wanted to undertake a task or not. Moreover, there would be no problem even if he didn't complete a single task throughout his career in this organization. However, he would obviously have to complete the tasks if he needed additional benefits. Everything depended on his contribution. He wouldn't be able to enjoy bonuses without contributing any points. He understood this well. After all, an organization needed lots of resources to grow and get stronger. Only then could it give benefits to its members. This was a common thing required for the growth of an organization or a sect. The leadership of this organization would end up getting their heads clamped by the gate if the organization only gave rewards to Yi Shiwen without seeking any returns. In fact, it would have appeared like a huge conspiracy if that had been the case, and Yi Shiwen wouldn't have joined it in that case. Where in the entire world can a person get free meals? One needs to pay something in order to get something. This is the truth of this world. Yi Shiwen shook his head and laughed as he thought this. He turned towards the hidden star peak and drew a long shadow under the moonlight as he trod forward. Yi Shiwen, Qi Fifan, and the whole group celebrated Yi Shiwen's win that night, and he left for the Metropolis Marshall Peak without disturbing anybody the next morning. The Metropolis Marshall Peak had become the true Marshall University's core place. However, the true Marshall Secret Territory's contribution couldn't be ignored either. In fact, everyone knew that it was the most dreadful place in the entire true Marshall University. "Brother Yi." Zheng Hushu's voice sounded not from afar. He wore a smile on his face as he came over treading the void. "Hello, senior brother Zhang." Yi Shiwen cupped his hands in obeisance and said. Zhang Hexiu didn't exchange any further greetings with Yi Shiwen and directly came to the point. "Come with me. Let's go to the true martial's secret territory." Yi Shiwen followed Zhang Hexiu to the depths of the metropolis Martial Peak and arrived at an open and desolate area. They had merely landed when an old man arrived limping. Zhang Hexiu promptly stepped forward and saluted the old man. He said, "Hello, senior. The Supreme Lord has asked me to bring Yi Shiwen to the true martial secret territory." The skinny old man looked at Yi Shiwen. He let out a smile and said, "You're Yi Shiwen? Good, very good." It seemed as if he was impressed with Yi Shiwen. "I'm flattered, senior." Yi Shiwen promptly saluted and replied. The way this old man was limping made it seem as if he would be blown away by the wind the next moment. However, Yi Shiwen didn't dare to underestimate him. He was the guard of the true martial's secret territory. How could he be an ordinary person? "I must say that there aren't many people in the younger generation who are as talented as you." The old man's eyes flashed. It seemed as if he had seen through Yi Shiwen's secrets. He had seen through Yi Shiwen's suave aura in just a glance, and had also noticed the fact that he had condensed 1,000 Tao principles. Consequently, a trace of amazement had flashed in his eyes. The old man didn't say much. He quickly unwound a seal with his finger. Then, an incredibly large force ripped the void open, and a portal appeared. Rumble! The void had been ripped apart into two halves along with the sound of the explosion, and another world had been exposed. Rivers and interconnected mountains were spread everywhere. There were fresh clouds and gentle winds all around. In fact, it almost looked like a microcosm. Both of them went straight into the true martial's secret territory. Yi Shiwen looked as far as he could. However, it seemed unending. The size of the true martial's secret territory was simply beyond his imagination. Rich spirit energy blew against his face. It was so strong that he could even see them with naked eyes. It was several times stronger than the spirit energy in the outside world. The underground spirit arteries were boiling. Yi Shiwen even suspected that these might be dragon's arteries. Yi Shiwen was seeing dragon's arteries for the third time in his life. The first one he had seen had already dried up. Only a few chunks of dragon essence were left in them at the time. He had come across a dragon's arteries for the second time on the planet of the Wind Dragon, but they had been locked up under the ground by some ancient almighty. However, he wasn't sure whether the spiritual arteries located here were dragon's arteries or not. He had merely made a guess, but he didn't have any proof, and he obviously couldn't confirm it, even if he was right. It was a divine item. Therefore, countless experts must be keeping watch over it, since it ensured the true martial university's prosperity. The biggest difference between dragon's arteries and spiritual arteries was that the former could bring luck and prosperity and could assist a sect or force in its growth and development. It was quite difficult for a sect's luck energy stock to exhaust if the dragon's veins weren't depleted. Both of them went inside the true martial secret territory. They passed through many different regions. They also saw many powerhouses who had tyrannical strengths and extremely powerful auras. They were submerged deep in their cultivation. Suddenly, an extremely tyrannical divine sense swept over both of them. Then it shrank back. These experts are the genuine elites of our true martial university. Many of them had become famous 1,000 years ago, and there are also those who had become famous several thousand years ago. Zhang Hexiu gave an introduction. These people had once made great contributions to the true martial university, so they've been allowed to stay here forever in return. Zhang Hexiu explained further. A somewhat desirous look had appeared on his face. To get an opportunity to cultivate here for a year was considered a great fortune. What could only possibly speak of an opportunity to stay here forever? Yi Shiwen nodded. He had done some research last night. However, the true understanding of the true martial secret territory couldn't be obtained in one day of research. Even many of the sage experts weren't allowed to stay here for a year, let alone staying here forever. He didn't know what kind of contribution these people had made towards the true martial university that they had received such privilege in return. He couldn't help but became speechless in the secrecy of his heart. Watermoon Fairyland was located in the core place of the true martial secret territory. Zhang Hushu's growth rate wasn't quick, so he really wanted to cultivate here. But Yi Shiwen was the one who had arrived to cultivate here at this time, and he had merely guided him till here. He couldn't cultivate here in secrecy. However, it would be great if he could stay here for some more time. Yi Shiwen didn't mind that either. So he also continued to observe the true martial secret territory along the way. Both of them soon entered an endless desert. It was stretched as far as one could see. There were sandstorms billowing everywhere. In fact, the range of these sandstorms seemed nearly endless. Most importantly, Yi Shiwen almost didn't feel a bit of spirit energy here. He had been able to feel the world principles very clearly before. However, they were very faintly visible here. In fact, they were almost hard to feel. To be continued. Chapter 469. Chapter 469. He's really a freak. It seemed as if this place had experienced the doomsday. The spirit energy of this place had been seemingly used up. The principles were disrupted. Yi Shiwen felt as if he had returned to his previous life on the earth, the era of the end of principles. What kind of a place is this? How there can be such a place in the true martial secret territory? Yi Shiwen asked. This place had toppled his impression regarding the true martial secret territory. He had previously thought that a place like the true martial secret territory would be filled with heavenly treasures and spirit energy. In fact, he had almost guessed every situation he had seen so far after he had entered this territory. So he hadn't thought that there would be such a desolate place inside. The sandstorm was rising in the distance. The northern wind was whistling in the endless sand. A figure slowly came out of it in small steps. Not a bit of real elemental energy was fluctuating on his body. Not even the principles were fluctuating on him. He looked like an ordinary person who was facing difficulty in walking through the sandstorm. And it seemed as if he was carrying heavy weight on his body since his feet were getting stuck in the sand with every step he took. It was hard to tell how long it took him, but he arrived near these two men. However, it seemed as if he hadn't seen them since he simply walked past them. He wasn't distracted one bit by their presence. It seemed as if nothing in this world could distract him from his purpose. He went away from them in his usual small-stepped style of walk. However, Yi Shiwen clearly noticed that he possessed a terrifying aura. Zhang Hushu opened his mouth and spoke only when that man had gone far away. These people are the hardship cultivators. This world is opened up especially for them. These people might be the strongest of our true martial university. However, they are also a group of lunatics. A scared look had appeared on Zhang Hushu's face when he had spoken the word lunatics. Hardship cultivators. Yi Shiwen had seen the records on these people in some ancient books. These were a group of people who bore hardships happily. They would try to use all kinds of methods to torture their body and spirit, and they would gain enlightenment by enduring endless pain. They would sublimate within pain and suffering to learn about the world principles through experience. Zhang Hushu was right when he had addressed them as a group of lunatics. They were a genuine group of madmen. They weren't like the other ruthless experts. The ruthless experts would force their enemies to such an extreme situation from where they might not be able to come out. And even a naive person might transform into an incredibly tyrannical person in the usual style of cultivation. However, these hardship cultivators weren't like that. They were ruthless towards their enemies, but they were even more ruthless upon themselves. They would use all kinds of cruel methods to deal with their enemies, but would use even worse ones upon themselves. So their minds and bodies were very dreadful. These hardship cultivators were considered the most formidable group of people inside any sect because they weren't afraid of death. They looked like a group of madmen in a real fight because didn't care about their own lives. Moreover, these hardship cultivators rarely went out of their way to provoke others for a fight. However, it would be a dead end for others if they dared to provoke them. Yi Shiwen hadn't seen anything on the body of that person. However, he had guessed that this man had probably added a matrix formation on his own body to increase the gravitational force upon himself. This was quite common because these hardship cultivators didn't practice any sort of body power techniques. They would purely rely on such oppressive methods for strengthening their bodies. They believed that human body was God's masterpiece in itself. So it was the most perfect thing in the entire world in their eyes. Therefore, practicing those body power techniques would transform one's constitution and would make the human body profane as a result. Only the natural methods were the best in their opinions. This was a simple method. However, it was very difficult to stick to it for a long time. There had been many hardship cultivators among the powerful entities of previous generations. These people weren't born that easily, but they had made the entire world tremble whenever they had taken birth. Yi Shiwen couldn't help but secretly swallow his saliva as he saw the figure of that man disappear into the distance. These people genuinely deserved to be called madmen. Cultivating in an environment which was devoid of spirit energy and principles was a very big test of people. A person must laboriously temper their body. And it was even harder in this kind of situation where one couldn't feel the principles or utilize their real elemental energy. One must save even a thread of one's real elemental energy to use in such an environment where there wasn't a bit of spirit energy. One might not be able to make a single breakthrough even after one had practiced for 10 years or 100 years in such harsh conditions. However, one would advance by leaps and bounds once they had made the breakthrough. This type of a cultivation method was indeed very harsh. Only a person who possessed great willpower could cultivate under such situation. Otherwise, it was impossible. Yi Shiwen admired this harsh cultivation method, but wouldn't use it himself. Both of them left for the centermost place of the true martial secret territory after they had passed through this desolate region. Even a sage expert like Zhang Hexiu had become extremely cautious in this region. The tyrannical divine senses would often sweep past them. However, these probing divine senses eventually disappeared once they had entered the Water Moon Fairyland. Yi Shiwen found that a barrier had been laid out around the Water Moon Fairyland, and this barrier had cut off those people's divine senses. Zhang Hexiu pointed towards the surroundings once they reached inside and spoke. This is the Water Moon Fairyland. The Water Moon Cave isn't accessible to the outside world in any other way. This is the only path. There are 49 heritages inside the Water Moon Fairyland, and you can choose any one of them for your comprehension. Even these heritages aren't open to the outside world. However, you're likely to reach the peak of the Great Sage Realm if you comprehend even one amongst them. Zhang Hexiu looked at Yi Shiwen with an envious look in his eyes. Each of these 49 heritages was outstanding. One would become extremely powerful if the said individual managed to cultivate even one of them to the depth. However, not everyone could obtain such an opportunity. Even the Heaven's Pride experts must wait for a long time until they had entered the Sage Realm. Only then might they get enrolled for cultivating in this place. He knew that Yi Shiwen was the only semi-sage expert who had been allowed to come here. Yi Shiwen looked as far as his eyes could see, but he only saw endless plains. 49 stone pillars stood erect on the plain. Each of these pillars was over 10,000 feet tall. There were some inexplicable symbols engraved on each of these pillars. These were possibly ancient seal characters. It was impossible for anyone to understand which race these scripts belonged to. However, one didn't need to read it in order to understand, one only needed to comprehend. That's because the people who had left these writings behind had also engraved their own insights into these stone pillars, and that meant that one would only need to comprehend those insights. Otherwise, no one would have been able to understand anything if they had only left these writings behind. Several people were sitting upright in front of these 49 stone pillars. Each of them was guarding a pillar and was deep in comprehension as well. Many of them looked very old and had long, thick beards. They were sitting upright and motionless. In fact, they almost seemed as if they were dead. These seemingly dead figures unexpectedly swept out their divine senses. One among them looked approximately 20 years old. However, his divine sense appeared like an exceptionally sharp sword. It looked like a long sword in the sky as it swept over. A dreadful aura swept into Yi Shiwen's body. He didn't wait for Yi Shiwen to counterattack and immediately pulled the divine sense back into his body. It happened so fast that Yi Shiwen couldn't even see it. Yi Shiwen was fortunate that the heavenly source mirror was protecting his body. Therefore, the imposing aura of that divine sense had hardly caused any effect on him. Not to mention that he presently wasn't the kind of a person whom anybody could have their own way with. On the contrary, Zhang Hushu had begun to have heartache because of the sudden attack of that imposing aura. "Are you okay?" Yi Shiwen asked. "I'm all right." Zhang Hushu shook his head, smiled, and replied. His complexion had turned somewhat pale. He had obviously replied with a lie. The truth was hidden in his heart. This true martial secret territory was very strange. A sage expert like him had sustained serious injuries by a person's mere divine sense. Yi Shiwen was obviously even more freakish. A sage expert who stood beside him had sustained injuries. However, he was fine. Moreover, his calm face made it obvious that he hadn't faced any difficulty. It seemed as if he simply hadn't been affected by it. He was truly a freak. However, it was understandable. He wouldn't have been allowed to come here while being in the semi-sage realm if he weren't a freak. Suddenly, several divine senses swept over with a whoosh sound. They read Yi Shiwen's strength and became somewhat amazed. They recalled their divine senses within a split second. Their time was very precious, so they couldn't waste it on such a trivial matter. They had only done this to verify that there was no danger. "Can I choose only one of these heritages?" Yi Shiwen asked. "That's right. You can choose only one." Zhang Hushu replied. "In fact, this rule is for your own good. Each of these heritages is supreme. You won't be able to learn anything if you try to study all of them at once." Yi Shiwen understood this point. However, he didn't feel that he couldn't study all of them. He had the help of mysterious space. So, the very question of not being able to study them all was outside the range of his consideration. But the mysterious space required spirit energy in order to function. And one shouldn't look at his stock of over 20 million primary spirit dawn as a lot. They seemed to be much at first, but all of it would be gone if he tried to study all of these heritages at once. So it would be pointless. When it came to learning heritages, it by no means meant that the more secret techniques one knew, the better it would get. First, one must take into account which technique would suit well. Secondly, one must see the possibility of being able to cultivate the secret technique to the greater extent. The more profound the cultivation gets, the better it would be for the said individual. He had already started to study his own heritages, such as ancient arts and secret techniques. Therefore, the most important thing for him wasn't to learn more and more secret techniques, since he had already learnt many secret techniques. Instead, he must fuse these secret techniques together and turn them into one system. He had learned many secret techniques, such as the Phoenix regeneration technique, Tyrant body technique, coiling dragon palm, overturning the heaven seal, and so on. Each of them possessed wonderful effects, and power. However, these techniques had come from different forces, and even from different races. They were scattered. So, Yi Shiwen's priority was to fuse these secret techniques and form one system. He might turn over a new leaf and form his very own secret technique sooner or later. This was very similar to making the breakthrough into the sage realm from one aspect. He would need to join the scattered and disorderly principles during the breakthrough, and would have to bring them into a situation where they would be separate but non-chaotic. Yi Shiwen had learned many secret techniques by now, and many of them had different systems. So, they weren't compatible and couldn't operate together without causing inconvenience. There were still obstructions. Therefore, studying all these heritages wasn't something he would choose to do. The fewer the better was certainly his choice considering the amount of primary spirit dawn he had in his pocket. Yi Shiwen proceeded to choose a heritage once he had made up his mind. To be continued. Chapter 470. Chapter 470 comprehends the secret cultivation. There were a myriad of inheritances. There were martial art techniques, internal power techniques, and so on. Peacock dragon hand, heavenly crane flash, 3-star strength, the fist of primal chaos, yearning god step. Yi Shiwen's gaze fell on these startling heritages, one by one. Huge stone pillars were erected steeply from the ground in succession, and they were towering from the ground. Each of them had a unique and imposing presence. Each of these pillars was extremely terrifying and contained the world's essence. These world's essences could easily suppress a powerful sage expert to death. Yi Shiwen couldn't help but frown as he saw them. These heritages might not have been left behind by the ancestors of the true martial university, because he could feel that these heritages were extremely extraordinary. No wonder it was said that one might become invincible in the true martial world if the said individual was able to comprehend any one of these. Yi Shiwen continued to look at these heritages as he walked past them. However, he didn't find any of them to be worthy of comprehension. Then he suddenly stopped in front of a monument. He felt as if his observing person scripture was getting virtually spurred within his body as soon as he stood in front of the stele. In fact, the small solar system within his body had involuntarily begun to revolve along a mysterious orbit. It was going to somewhere dark and mysterious like the real universe itself. Yi Shiwen was taken aback. He raised his head to see. He was surprised to see chaos above the stele. There was a drawing of an everlasting pattern of stars within the chaos. Moreover, there was a rotating nebula and a rotating universe. It looked different every time he saw it. Sometimes it looked like a complete universe. Sometimes he could only see a star. He felt as if his mind was being torn apart by merely watching such quick transformations taking place. Pant, pant, pant. Yi Shiwen was panting heavily. He had seen it for a moment only, and it seemed as if his mind had processed countless years. The entire back of his body had turned wet. What's the name of this stele? I choose this. He had walked down and had seen more than 10 heritages by now. However, none of them had been able to resonate with his observing person scripture. However, this stele had managed it. So, he was convinced with his decision. This is called Big Bang Stardust Fist. Zhang Heshu thought for a second before he explained. This is an unusual fist technique. It is said that one can grab the stars and seize the moon if this technique is practiced to the peak. One can even explode a star in one punch. Yi Shiwen couldn't help but become speechless in the secrecy of his heart. One could explode a star in one punch. Such strength was impossible to possess before the great sage realm. It was far too powerful. However, this fist technique is quite odd. Next to nobody has been able to comprehend it. History says that only the founder of your hidden star peak has comprehended it so far. Zhang Heshu added, only the founder of the hidden star peak had comprehended it once. There was no mystery to this fact. He had clearly seen his observing person scripture, being activated in a mysterious manner. So, there had to be some relation between it and something inside this heritage. Yishuin thought for a while, and he suddenly realized that the feeling he just experienced was quite similar to the one he had gotten at the time he had comprehended the hidden star scripture on the hidden star peak. Moreover, the hidden star scripture was also engraved on a stone wall. Could it be that these were a set of matching techniques? After all, his observing person scripture was inspired by the hidden star scripture. So, shouldn't there be some kind of relation on ideal terms? Countless years had flashed through Yi Shiwen's mind in this moment. However, he smiled the very next moment and replied, "I understand. I would like to choose this heritage. This one." Zhang Hushu felt somewhat awkward as he looked at Yi Shiwen. Next to nobody has ever been able to comprehend this heritage. But it's your choice at the end of the day. You don't need to force yourself if you can't do it. You can always switch to next the steel whenever you want. Okay. Yi Shiwen nodded. He wasn't stupid either. He obviously wouldn't force himself if he couldn't comprehend it. Okay, so I will take my leave now. I will wait to hear the good news from young brother. Zhang Hushu was somewhat reluctant to leave. He kept looking at this water-moon fairyland. However, he had no choice but to leave in the end. Yi Shiwen sat cross-legged in front of this Big Bang Stardust Fist. Once Zhang Hushu had departed, he raised his head and looked intently at that heritage. Big Bang Stardust Fist was engraved on the front side of the steel. These steels and martial arts secret books were different. Martial arts secret books would explain how to practice a technique in a straightforward manner. Every variation was clearly mentioned and explained to make a person understand. So, one only needed to follow the steps. However, these incredible heritages often required to be comprehended on one's own. They were similar to the coiling dragon palm, which must be comprehended by oneself. Only the essence, energy, and spirit were left behind to guide the practitioner in the right direction. It would have been impossible for Yi Shiwen to comprehend the coiling dragon palm, as per his then strength and level, if he didn't possess the mysterious space. In fact, it would have been impossible for him to break down the coiling dragon palm and comprehend it to the pinnacle if he didn't possess the mysterious space. Thus, he would have had to struggle to comprehend it layer by layer through constant practice. There were obviously some techniques he had learnt which had been described in books as well. For example, Phoenix regeneration technique was described in a book. In fact, its level was still comparatively higher at that time because the martial arts techniques would become very mysterious after a certain level. Then, one would be able to comprehend them depending on their own experience and level. And those who couldn't comprehend would never be able to comprehend even if one would describe it to them personally with their own mouth. How many secret techniques could one comprehend by depending on their perception and level as per their experience? The same was true for the coiling dragon palm and Big Bang Stardust Fist. However, the Phoenix regeneration technique was explained in such an easy language that everyone could understand its esoteric concepts by merely reading it. It was obviously different than the coiling dragon palm. So, it had to be comprehended personally, and the extent of its comprehension depended on one's own capability. It didn't matter whether the founder of these secret techniques and heritages had placed them in terms of relative superiority. Yi Shiwen wouldn't become disheartened even if the Big Bang Stardust Fist was the most inferior one among them. This Big Bang Stardust Fist would appear like a star atlas to outsiders. It looked so simple. However, it looked completely different to Yi Shiwen. It appeared like a massive array of revolving stars to his eyes. He felt as if he could almost see through the entire universe by looking at the star atlas, and this was a profound feeling that had gripped his heart. In fact, he had almost lost himself in that carefree feeling. This star atlas had revealed the mysteries of the stars. Yi Shiwen could nearly feel the secrets of the stars. It was a mysterious yet profound feeling. However, he couldn't see it clearly. That's why this feeling had made him very depressed. Countless, primary spirit dawn had begun to burn inside the heavenly source mirror. The released spirit energy seemingly formed a long liver and flowed into the mysterious space. The mysterious space had been silent until now. However, it began to operate crazily once an endless influx of spirit energies poured into it, and those mysterious and profound insights he couldn't understand in the beginning had been absorbed by the mysterious space. It then began to analyze them in a frantic manner. Yi Shiwen had comprehended countless esoteric insights in this split second, even though he couldn't understand them earlier. Those groups of characters which had earlier appeared like nonsense had transformed into simplified language. In fact, they could be easily comprehended by merely looking at them now. This massive information was engraved in Yi Shiwen's mind. This gave him an extremely satisfied feeling. In fact, this feeling of sudden and bright comprehension couldn't be compared or replaced with another. Moreover, only Yi Shiwen could have dared to do such a thing. An average person wouldn't dare to comprehend so much in such a continuous manner. Otherwise, the comprehension of their martial way might have gotten affected by it. After all, the martial technique created by someone would contain its own way. And this was even more so for a martial technique that needed to be comprehended instead of being followed. After all, such a martial technique contained the majority of the founder's own perception of the martial way. Therefore, a person would get immersed into a martial technique while comprehending it. This was very dangerous. One might get stuck inside it if immersed too deep, and might never be able to come out of its maze to revert back to one's own way. And this would obviously limit their future prospects. Therefore, the people who wanted to comprehend such martial techniques must possess strong willpower, and they must possess formidable mental strength. Otherwise, they might become idiots by the impact. Even those so-called peerless geniuses wouldn't dare to immerse themselves into a martial technique like Yi Shiwen had, because they might never be able to come out of it. Only he could do this, since he had help from his mysterious space. His innate aptitude may have differed by much from those peerless geniuses. However, his progress speed wasn't slow. Time passed day by day, and that star atlas didn't look like a sea of stars in Yi Shiwen's eyes as time passed. In fact, it had slowly begun to form galaxies. It seemed as if Yi Shiwen was sitting cross-legged at the center of a universe while he was sitting in front of the steel. The universe was empty, and there wasn't a single object in it at first. In fact, there was deathly stillness throughout. However, it had begun to become more and more profound as his comprehension became more and more deep. Stars had also begun to appear inside his body as time had passed. A giant star had appeared inside Yi Shiwen's body at first. Then it had exploded into infinite rays of light, which had then illuminated the entire universe. This was the only source of light in this universe, and he was the only living creature inside it. He was also the only god of this universe. This universe didn't exist in real. It only existed in his spiritual world. However, there was no difference between this universe and the real one. These stars and this universe were born from his idea, and they would extinguish with one thought his. Yi Shiwen genuinely felt like a god because of this feeling. The universe had been formed by this thought, and it could be extinguished by his thought. He was like the legendary Buddha who was mentioned in the fables, the only true god in the universe. It was as if he could see the world in a grain of sand. Many stars gradually began to appear as his comprehension became more and more deep. Stars began to appear, planets began to appear, satellites began to appear, cosmic dust began to appear, and meteorites began to appear. It looked more and more like a universe, and more like the real universe. Yi Shiwen's progress was extremely fast. An average person couldn't match his speed, even if they possessed a God-given wisdom and rare talent. However, he could achieve such speed. He had already comprehended this Big Bang stardust fist to an incredible extent with the assistance of the mysterious space. In addition, his observing person scripture had also formed a universe inside his body. So, his speed obviously wouldn't be lessened since he possessed some prior experience. To be continued.